How's it going, guys? White Rabbit here. Today I'd like to talk to you about something that I've been researching pretty intently for the past few weeks, and it basically has to do with our understanding of the universe and how the universe came to be. In this recent research, I have discovered that there are many different scientific theories that are not commonly taught in school. What's most interesting is that these different theories paint a very different picture of our universe and our place in it. So in this video, I'm going to be going through these various different theories, and at the end, I'm going to tie them all together. And what is so neat about this is that it just so happens that it correlates exactly with the book of Genesis and the creation story that was depicted in it. Therefore, I have decided to call this theory the Genesis theory. Now, I understand that many of my subscribers don't necessarily agree that the Bible is the Word of God. For the purpose of this video, though, hopefully it shouldn't really matter, because although I will be comparing this theory to the book of Genesis and using several creationist points to support the claims that I will be addressing, by the end of this, hopefully even my agnostic viewers will appreciate this theory and add it to their arsenal of varying perspectives. So without further ado, the first thing I want to address is the stigma against the typical creation theory.
What would you say to some of the parents who are like, look, we're going to go ahead, we'll learn about evolution, but we also believe in creationism. What is the harm in learning the Bible's creation story?
Well, learning the story is fine. I mean, that's great. But it's not science. And tax dollars used for science education shouldn't be used to teach creationism as an alternative. Creationism is not right.
The notion of creationism, or in fact, look, Senator Marco Rubio, who's presumably a reasonably intelligent man, was asked, what's the age of the Earth? And ultimately, either because he actually believed it or he was trying to appeal to some constituency, had to argue that it's a big mystery, that somehow we should teach kids both ideas that the Earth is 6,000 years old and that it's 4.55 billion years old, which is what it is. If you think about that, somehow saying that, well, anything goes, we shouldn't offend religious beliefs by requiring kids to understand reality. That's child abuse.
It sounds very laudable to teach the controversy, to teach both theories, but there aren't two theories. There's only one theory around. There's only one game in town as far as serious science is concerned. Of course, you get negative reactions from creationists, but who cares about creationists? They don't know anything.
The scientific community has done an excellent job of portraying the counter view of creation as being strictly religious and without scientific merit. In actuality, that couldn't be further from the truth. If you have done any amount of serious research looking into the creation perspective, you will see that it has every bit as much scientifically sound research behind it as evolution and the Big Bang Theory, and arguably it has more. The problem is, what we see going on here is a smear campaign. The thing that is so dangerous about this, and what is so worrisome about this, is that instead of teaching multiple different theories to children in school and allowing them to draw their own conclusions, they're pushing one perspective. Now, the reason that they are able to get away with this is because up until now, creationists have done an excellent job of explaining why the Earth is probably not as old as we think it is. And they've done an excellent job of explaining Noah's flood and how it shaped the Earth that we see and know today. But none of them really have a good explanation as to how it all got started in the first place. And I think that's the biggest problem and the biggest hurdle that creationists need to overcome. Because when we look at something like evolution, it's backed by the theory of the Big Bang. But when we look at the creation side of things, seemingly the only explanation is that God put us all here. And I think that's the real big disconnect, and why it's so easy to convince people that one is science and the other is religion. Well, in this video, I'm going to try and make an extraordinary claim. I'm going to try to explain to you how God made the earth, the universe, and everything we know. just a few thousand years ago. But in order to explain this, I'm going to have to first go through several other theories that you probably have never heard of or have ever considered as a possibility. And that is because it was never taught to us in school. Just a couple of the different theories that I'll be addressing in this video are going to completely contradict things like the heliocentric model, for example, or even the theory of gravity itself. But before we get really into those hard-hitting topics, I need to lay a foundation on which to build upon. Now, I understand that most of you have probably already done a significant amount of research into the creation perspective. But just in case you haven't, I need to make sure that I go ahead and dedicate a portion of this film to going through some of the basics of the creation perspective so that we can then build from that point on. Now, just to let you guys know, I will be using the Bible as the foundation in which to explain this creation narrative, at least initially. But later in the film, I will be talking about the varying creation legends and interweaving them into this model as well. So although I will be taking a strictly biblical approach in the beginning here, and these video clips that I will be presenting will be biblically based, I will address it from varying angles later on in the film. But we have to start somewhere, so here we go.
Now, I made a decision years ago as a new Christian. I was 16 when I got saved, and all the atheists in my city started coming after me, trying to get me converted, away from Christianity. And I had some real problems believing some of the things in the Bible. They were showing me supposed contradictions and all that. We'll cover more on that in video 7. I had to make a decision as a 16-year-old new Christian. I said, Lord, I'm going to believe your book until somebody can prove it's wrong. Some of my friends decided they're going to doubt the Bible until it's proven right. I think that's a mistake. I think I made the right decision. I said, God, I'm going to believe you even for the things I don't understand. And he's proven himself on just about every one of them. There's a couple I still got questions about. And the Bible says Adam was the first man, and he was 130 when Seth was born, and Seth was 105 when Enos was born. If you go through the Bible and add up the dates, it's not that hard to do. You'll come to a date of about 6,000 BC, or 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC for the creation. That's the dates you get from adding up the ones given in the Bible. Is it possible for a person to live over 900 years? You could learn a lot in 900 years. Things were very different back then. Textbooks in school are going to tell your kids dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. Is that true? Well, if the Earth's only 6,000 years old, that can't be true. Where do dinosaurs fit in? Did dinosaurs live millions of years ago, or have they always lived with humans? They just had a different name for them. They called them dragons. The Bible says in 2 Peter chapter 3, knowing this first, there shall come in the last days scoffers. Did you know there are people that scoff at the Bible? I deal with them on a regular basis. I attract them like a lightning rod. The scoffers out there, they hate me. I'm trying to be nice to them, okay? But they just don't like me. They don't appreciate this. What a nice, wonderful guy I am. The scoffers, the Bible says, are going to be walking after their own lust. You know the reason people scoff at the Bible? It's not because of their science. They think it is, okay? But no, they scoff at the Bible because of their lust. They don't want God telling them what to do. That's the bottom line every single time. The scoffers are going to say, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. That's an important phrase, but the scoffers are going to say the way things are happening now is the way things have always been happening. Uniformitarianism. The Bible says the scoffers are willingly ignorant. Willingly ignorant. In the Greek, that means dumb on purpose. The scoffers are dumb on purpose of two things, and here they are. Number one, that by the word of God, the heavens were of old. Notice the word heaven is plural. Heavens. There's more than one heaven. We'll talk about that in a minute. The scoffers are ignorant of how God made the heavens by his word, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Now, there's a strange phrase. How can the earth be out of the water and in the water? But look, it says, the heavens and the earth were made by his word. You know, when God made the universe, he didn't lift one finger. He didn't turn one screw or pound one nail. He just spoke. And every molecule lined up. That's incredible to think about. When he speaks, the waves lay down, the wind quits blowing. When he speaks, the dead come to life. When he speaks, the universe is created. Everything obeys the voice of God, except us. He's having some trouble out of us right now, but he's going to fix that one of these days when every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father, coming soon to a city near you. But the scoffers are willingly ignorant of how God made the heavens by his word, and they're ignorant of how the earth was standing out of the water and in the water. In other words, they're ignorant of the original creation. What was it like? We'll talk about that in a second. The second thing they're ignorant of is the flood. It says the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. This world was destroyed by a flood, totally annihilated.
Many people will ask, what about the ancient accounts of a flood, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh? They say that these different accounts prove that the Bible plagiarized earlier stories. I am sometimes amused at this assertion, as the person saying them often doesn't realize that this is a case in favor of the Bible being true. And it is true that the Epic of Gilgamesh and others are very similar to the biblical account. In fact, there are quite a few more that I would like to add to the list before we get started. Legends have surfaced in hundreds of cultures throughout the world that tell of a huge, catastrophic flood that destroyed most of mankind, and that was survived only by a few individuals and animals. Although most historians who have studied this matter estimate that these legends number in the 200s, according to evolutionary geologist Robert Sosch, quote, Noah is but one tale in a worldwide collection of at least 500 flood myths, which are the most widespread of all ancient myths and therefore can be considered among the oldest. Sosch went on to observe, narratives of a mass inundation are found all over the world. Stories of a great deluge are found on every inhabited continent and among a great many different language and culture groups. Over a century ago, the famous Canadian geologist Sir William Dawson wrote about how the record of the flood, quote, is preserved in some of the oldest historical documents of several distinct races of men, and is indirectly corroborated by the whole tenor of the early history of most of the civilized races. Legends have been reported from nations such as China, Babylon, Mexico, Egypt, Sudan, Syria, Persia, India, Norway, Wales, Ireland, Indonesia, Romania, etc., composing a list that could go on for many pages. Although the vast number of such legends is surprising, the similarity between much of their content is equally amazing. James Perloff noted, in 95% of the more than 200 flood legends, the flood was worldwide. In 88%, a certain family was favored. In 70%, survival was by means of a boat. In 67%, animals were also saved. In 66%, the flood was due to the wickedness of man. In 66%, the survivors had been forewarned. In 57%, they ended up on a mountain. And in 35%, birds were sent out from the boat. And in 9%, exactly 8 people were spared. What is the significance of the various flood legends? We have well over 200 flood legends, and possibly more than 500. Many of the legends come from different ages and civilizations that could not possibly have copied any of the similar legends. The legends were recorded long before any missionaries arrived to relate them to the Genesis account of Noah, and almost all civilizations have some sort of flood legend. The conclusion to be drawn from such facts is that in the distant past, there was a colossal flood that forever affected the history of all civilizations. Those living after the flood did not have the book of Genesis to read to their descendants. Genesis was not written until several hundred years after the flood. The account of the flood was passed on from one generation to the next. Many parents and grandparents told their children and grandchildren about the huge ark, the animals, the devastating flood, long before the Genesis record ever existed. Alfred Rehwinkel wrote, traditions similar to this record are found among nearly all the nations and tribes of the human race, and this is as one would expect it to be. If that awful world catastrophe, as described in the Bible, actually happened, the existence of the flood traditions among the widely separated and primitive people is just what is to be expected. After the cultural trappings are stripped away from the kernel of truth in the various stories, there is almost complete agreement among practically all flood accounts. A universal destruction by water of the human race and all other living things occurred. B, an ark or boat was provided as the means of escape for some. And C, a seed of mankind was provided to perpetuate humanity. As Foreman Curley once observed, these traditions agree in too many vital points not to have originated from the same factual event. In Volume 3 of his multi-volume set, The Native Races of the Pacific Slope, H. Bancroft wrote, there never was a myth without meaning. There is not one of these stories, no matter how silly or absurd, which was not founded on fact. So on the first point, this assertion that the ancient flood stories somehow challenge the biblical account is backwards. Ancient accounts of the flood are exactly what you would expect to find if the flood actually occurred, as are the various differences in the minor details that are observed. This too is what one would expect, like a game of telephone. The question then becomes, is the Genesis account more reliable, and if so, why? On the second point, I would like to address the issue of borrowing, since some claim that the accounts can be demonstrated to be written down before the book of Genesis, and that there is a chance that the writer of Genesis could have known about the Epic of Gilgamesh or another account and simply plagiarized it. Now, what is interesting about this assertion of dependence is that it is never asserted to be a literary dependence. All scholars agree that the differences in detail and content between Genesis and the Mesopotamian precursors are detrimental against it. Even scholars that do think the Hebrew accounts were dependent on the earlier Mesopotamian accounts are quick to point out that it is not literary dependence. Listen to these authors and remember that they are trying to prove that there is borrowing, but know that they cannot, from a scholarly, literary perspective, assert it. Quote, the derivative nature of the biblical flood narrative, or rather the existence of an antecedent Mesopotamian tradition from the earlier forms of the biblical story, is undeniable. However, the extent to which the latter narrative is derived from the earlier tradition remains uncertain. A direct form of literary influence cannot be asserted, as the distinctive features of the representative narratives are too plentiful to allow such an affirmation. All one can say is that the biblical accounts must have been influenced by the Mesopotamian oral tradition or by a pre-existing series of such orally transmitted traditions. I would assert here that this is exactly what you would expect if such a flood really did happen. Another author asserts, however, it has yet to be shown that there was borrowing, even indirectly. Differences between the Babylonian and the Hebrew traditions can be found in factual details of the flood narrative, from the ark, the duration of the flood, the identity of the birds and their dispatch, and are most obvious in the ethical and religious concepts of the whole of each composition. All who suspect or suggest borrowing by the Hebrews are compelled to admit large-scale revision, alteration, and reinterpretation in a fashion that cannot be substantiated for any other composition from the ancient Near East or in any other Hebrew writings. If there was borrowing, then it can have been extended only as far as the, quote, historical framework, and not included intention or interpretation. And another author states, it is obvious the differences are too great to encourage a belief in direct connection between Atrahasis and Genesis, but just as obviously there is some kind of involvement in the historical traditions generally of the two peoples. So basically, from a scholarly, literary perspective, there was no borrowing that can be demonstrated, and even the skeptics know this. Now to the final point, which is, if there are many accounts of this event from all over the world, why should we consider the one in Genesis to be more reliable from a historical perspective? And while there is a debate on which ones came first, we will assume, for the sake of argument, that the Mesopotamian accounts were first. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the biblical account of Noah's flood have a lot of similarities. This is no surprise, since they are both retelling the same event in history, most likely, a worldwide flood. But like thousands of flood legends around the world, the Gilgamesh story seems to have suffered from poor record-keeping. See if you can tell what's wrong. Let's take a look at each vessel. Here they are, drawn to scale, using the same cubit length of 0.5 meters. There's a good chance that the Gilgamesh storyteller got his icons confused. Rumor has it that a certain tower in Babylon was built on a square base. Yet some modern scholars want you to think that the Noah story grew out of the Babylonian mess-ups like this. The breadth-to-depth ratio is famous, of course. Everyone knows that 1.67 BD works very well and is quite normal for a cargo ship. This is an important factor for roll stability, but also has a bearing on the seakeeping. Increasing the width will provide even more stability, but at a cost. Roll accelerations can increase to uncomfortable and even dangerous levels. The length-to-depth ratio dominates the strength properties of the hull. Too long and shallow and the ship might break in half, due to the bending applied by the waves. The KRISO-based study indicated that 30 centimeter or 12 inches timber hull and a 40 centimeter structure would be sufficient for waves up to 30 meters high, which is a significant wave height. Noah's Ark has a very good proportion for a ship. Naval architects at the world-class KRISO facility conducted a study on Noah's Ark and found the vessel's proportions to be nearly optimal. The 6-to-1 length-to-breadth ratio is a little wider than today's vessels designed to move forward quickly, but it provides increased stability for a drifting vessel. A longer vessel has disadvantages for stability and seakeeping, as the U.S. Navy discovered. There is another factor that gives us confidence that the biblical account is historically reliable, namely its track record. It is my belief that God anticipated man asking, "How do we know if this book is from God? Why should we trust it?" And God basically decided to validate it by doing something that only God would be able to do. That is, write the history of the world in advance, and never get a single detail wrong. That's right. And you might not hear this statistic from skeptics because they tend not to talk about it. But the Bible was about 25% prophecy at the time that it was written. And they were very specific prophecies about people, places, wars, empires that would come and how they would fall, even specific names. This book claims to be the Word of God, and then it goes on to prove it. So when asking if it can be trusted, I would ask you to challenge these claims.
The third thing they're ignorant of is the coming judgment. Next verse says, "But the heavens and the earth which are now by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." See, the scoffers are ignorant of the creation. They don't want to admit God created the world because that would mean He owns it. They don't want to admit there was a flood because, that proves God has the authority to judge His creation. They don't like that idea. And they sure don't want to admit there's a coming judgment. Sadly, many Christians are also ignorant of what that original creation was like and what that flood did to this world. And so because of their ignorance of the creation and the flood, it causes Christians to compromise the clear teaching of God's Word. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. By the way, in Genesis 1:1, it's heaven singular. Later, it's always heavens plural. When He first made it, it was heaven, one heaven, and then later He divides it up into 3 slices. First heaven, second heaven, third heaven. But look at verse 5. It says, "The evening and the morning were the first day." Notice that word the, T-H-E. In English, that is called the definite article. The first day. This is King James Version, which I use and I recommend everybody use if you speak English. I collect other versions of the Bible. I'm not afraid of them, but folks, there have been some very serious changes made in some of these other versions. Many have left out the blood in dozens of places. Many have taken away the deity of Christ. There's some serious changes. Many have taken out over 200 verses. I got down my Revised Standard Version that I got for perfect attendance in 4th grade at the Methodist Church. I was raised in an extremely liberal Methodist church in the Peoria area. And so I got down my Bible collection and I was going to see how they treated the Genesis story. What differences are there? And it says in the reversed version, there was evening and there was morning, one day. Now wait just a minute. What happened to the first day? How many the first days are there in history? One. How many one days are there in history? All of them, any of them, right? Why did they call it one day? And down in verse 8, they called it a second day instead of the second day. Well, I found out the guys who did the reviled version do not believe in a literal 6-day creation. And just about every other translation available changes it from the first day to one day. You can check it out for yourself. These people, many of them, believe in what's called the gap theory. How many have ever heard of the gap theory before? The gap theory was made up in 1814 by a Scottish preacher named Thomas Chalmers. He said, there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, and there's millions or billions of years in there. Nobody thought of the gap theory till the 1800s, after it became popular to teach the earth was millions of years old. See, in 1795, a book was written that said the earth is millions of years old, and Christians, some of them believed it and said, wow, we've got to make the Bible say that. And so they scrambled with compromised positions. Gap theory, day-age theory, progressive creation. We cover more on that in a minute. But the gap theory was one of the ones came up with in 1814 to teach that maybe there's millions or billions of years between the first 2 verses. That's what I was taught when I went to Bible college. That's what the Schofield Reference Bible teaches too. They say between the first 2 verses of Genesis, there is ample scope for all the geologic eras. They say there's a pre-Adamite rebellion and the judgment of Lucifer happened. Now, just a minute. Was anybody here before Adam? Was there a pre-Adamite rebellion? And exactly when did Lucifer get judged and fall from heaven? Well, we better see what the Scripture says. Genesis 1:2 says the earth was without form and void. In the Hebrew, that's tohu wabohu, which means unformed and unfilled. Without form means without form. And void means void, empty. It doesn't mean destroyed. It just means it's not done yet. That's all, okay? To me, it's one of the most dangerous heresies in the history of Christianity, the gap theory. And it is heresy, okay? This house, for instance, is unformed and unfilled. Nobody's living in it. But it's not destroyed. Unformed and unfilled doesn't have to mean destroyed. Now, there is a verse in Jeremiah that uses the same phrase, without form and void. In this case, the Jeremiah passage is talking about a city that has been destroyed. He looked at the mountains, they trembled, the hills moved lightly, there was no man, the birds fled. This can't be talking about the creation. The birds weren't made till day 5. This is not talking about the creation. This is talking about a city that's been judged. This passage has nothing to do with the creation. This house also is unformed and unfilled, okay? The Bible says in Exodus 20, in 6 days, the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. What do you suppose he meant by that? This is part of the 10 Commandments. He wrote this on a rock with his finger, okay? He don't stutter. It looks to me like he's trying to tell us he did it all in 6 days. Now, would that include Lucifer? Would that include the angels? That would include everything, wouldn't it? Everything in heaven and earth. The question is not, what does it say? The question is, do you believe what it says? So if somebody says Lucifer fell from heaven before the creation, they already have a conflict with this verse. Exodus 20:11 continues to say, and he rested on the seventh day. If there's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, this is not the seventh day. But all through Scripture, it keeps referring to the seventh day. Exodus 31, it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested. The seventh day. It mentions it over and over, the seventh day. Hebrews chapter 4, the seventh day. So, Romans 5 tells us, by one man sin came into the world, and death by sin. Death reigned from Adam to Moses. By man came death. The Bible's real clear. But if the gap theory is true, and it was a pre-Adamite civilization, and they died when Lucifer fell from heaven, you now have death before sin. A clear heresy. Not at all what the Bible teaches. The Bible says death is an enemy. People say, well, don't plants die? If Adam ate the apple, didn't it die? Oh, you better first check out and see if plants are alive. They have no blood, no breath. They wither, they fade. Plants are not alive in the biblical classification of things, okay? The Bible says God told Adam to replenish the earth. And the gap theory folks always say, well, see right there, it says replenish. And the word replenish means fill again. Look it up in the dictionary. And sure enough, you look it up in a dictionary and it says replenish, fill again. Well, you better look up at the meaning of the word in 1611 when they translated this. The King James translators came across the word male, which means fill, and they chose the word replenish because back in 1611, the word replenish only meant fill. In 1650, an author named Bacon added a second definition to the word called fill again. It never meant fill again until 1650. You get some old dictionaries, like an 1828 dictionary, you can see for yourself. The primary meaning of the word replenish is fill. The secondary meaning is fill again, recover former fullness, added by Francis Bacon. English words change meanings. You see, God promised to preserve His word. He did not promise to preserve our English language. The gap theory folks teach us that the first earth was destroyed and God had to remake the earth. John Hagee has a beautiful chart he preaches in front of. He's got the first earth was destroyed when Satan fell from heaven, and then the second earth, and he said someday God's going to make a third earth. And it's a good sermon, and it preaches good, and it's a beautiful chart. He's got a good artist, but it's not scriptural. We're still standing on the first earth. Revelation 21 tells us, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth were passed away. This is still the first one. It got rearranged at the flood a little bit, but this is still the first earth. Hebrews tells us, he made the angels to be ministering spirits to those who are heirs of salvation. If you're a Christian, you got guardian angels. Here's some things to consider, okay? Number one, everything was created in 6 days. Number two, Satan was created. Satan was in Eden until he sinned. Eden was made on day 6. Angels are made to be ministering spirits for us, so why would God make them millions of years before we get here, okay? Satan rejoiced when the foundations of the earth were laid. The foundations were laid on day 3. Everything was very good at the end of day 6, and Adam was 130 when Seth was born. And before that, Cain and Abel were born, but no dates are given. So if you put 2 and 2 together, you can figure out, Satan must have fallen from heaven probably about 100 years after the creation. He could not have fallen from heaven before the creation. It doesn't fit the other scriptures. 1 Peter 2 tells us, no prophecy of the scriptures of any private interpretation. 1 Peter 1:20, okay? So you got to take Scripture with Scripture, and that's the only way you're going to fit it together. Gap theory was invented by a Scottish theologian named Thomas Chalmers. It violates many Scriptures. It puts death before sin. It has Satan fall before day 7. It has there are lots of questions you can ask gap theory people if they believe this. Okay, you get my little book about the gap theory if you'd like more on that. The arguments for the gap theory are either extremely weak or wrong or involve adding to God's Word. I'm not aware of any arguments for the gap theory that hold up to a real scrutiny compared to Scripture. And today, 75% of kids from Christian homes that go to public schools are going to reject the Christian faith, mostly because of this great age of the earth issue.
How old is the earth? Evolutionists claim it's 4.6 billion years old. But what does the evidence say? Let's take a look. There are so many evidences of a young earth. The Methuselah tree, the Great Barrier Reef, erosion rates. Continents are eroding at a rate that would level them in just 25 million years. We've got comets in our solar system, but they only last 100,000 years. Why do we still have comets? Sahara Desert is growing, oil is still under pressure, Earth's magnetic field is actually getting weaker, putting a maximum age of 25,000 years on it. Earth's rotation is slowing down, the moon is receding, the human population is at 6.5 billion. Trace that backwards, it all started 4,400 years ago, right when the Bible says the flood occurred. Why? Because the earth is young, not old.
The textbooks in our schools are filled with the idea of millions and billions of years. The next time you hear someone say millions and millions of years ago, stop them and ask, were you there? Science is knowledge derived from observation and study. Can you observe, study, or demonstrate something that happened billions of years ago? Absolutely not. It is true that over half the scientists believe in evolution. That is true, but that does not make evolution true. Just because a bunch of scientists believe something does not make it true. They have a long history of being wrong. They used to teach that a big rock will fall faster than a little rock. They were wrong. They used to teach that if you were sick you had bad blood. This was known as the doctrine of humors. It was believed that if you bled out the bad blood you would get better. There used to be places all over the United States where you could go and get your blood taken out. You knew where they were because out front they had a white pole with a red stripe around it. The barber was the bloodletter. And right beside George Washington, when they were bleeding him to death, was a Bible that told them, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Now let's say you went scuba diving and found a sunken boat with a treasure chest full of old coins. You look at one of the coins and it has a date of 1600 on it. You reach in and pull out another and it reads 1700. You reach in and pull out a third coin and it has a date of 1800. Now I'm going to ask you a simple question. When did the boat sink? You ought to be able to figure out that the boat sank after 1800. It could not have sank before 1800 because we have a coin in there from 1800. This most recently dated coin becomes the limiting factor on when the boat sank. There are numerous scientific ways to show the universe is not billions of years old. In 2011, the world's population reached 7 billion people. In 1985, there were 5 billion people on planet Earth. And in 1800, there were only 1 billion people on the planet. Most people agree that there were only about 1 billion people around 1800. The world's population at the time of Christ was about 250 million people. Starting from the Bible, we see that 6,000 years ago, God created everything. 4,400 years ago, there was a worldwide flood in which only 8 people survived. And this is exactly what the evidence shows. The current population shows only 4,400 years of growth. God's Word is truth. Let's talk about supernova rings. When a star blows up, it creates a nova or a supernova. Astronomers have observed that about every 30 years a star dies and explodes into a supernova. There are only about 300 supernovas. Let's see, 300 times 30 equals about 9,000 years. Well, if the universe is billions of years old, how come there are less than 300 supernovas? There should be several hundred million of them. This is evidence that shows that the universe is only thousands of years old, not billions. Textbooks say red giant stars evolve into white dwarf stars over billions of years. They teach that it takes billions of years for a star to evolve from a red giant to a white dwarf. Well, we know this is not true. Egyptian hieroglyphs from 2000 BC describe Sirius as red. It was observed to be red as recently as 150 AD. Today it is a white star binary. So no, it does not take billions of years for this to happen. It only takes thousands. Jupiter is cooling off and therefore cannot be billions of years old. If it were billions of years old, it would have cooled off by now. Here we have the moon. The moon goes around the Earth. I think we can all agree about this. As the moon goes around the Earth, it is gradually getting farther away. We are slowly losing the moon. It's leaving us a couple of inches per year. Not a big deal. But if the moon is getting farther and farther away every day, that means that it used to be closer. Well, if we bring the moon in closer, we start to create a problem because the moon is what causes the tides. If the moon were closer, the tides would be higher. There's a law called the inverse square law. If you brought the moon to 1/3 the distance, you flip the 1/3 and square it, you get 9 times the gravitational pull. If you were to do all the math on this, you will find out that the moon and the Earth would have been almost together just over 1 billion years ago. Walt Brown, in his book In the Beginning, says that this fact alone puts the age of the Earth-Moon system at less than 1.2 billion years max. Short period comets are losing material and have a life expectancy of less than 10,000 years. If the universe is billions of years old, why do we still see comets? They should all be gone by now. Magnets lose their strength with time. The Earth's magnetic strength has declined 10% in the last 150 years and 40% in the last 1,000 years. Since it is getting weaker, that means that it used to be stronger, and it cannot be more than 25,000 years old. The Earth's magnetic field alone limits the Earth to being less than 25,000 years old. This also means that carbon dating cannot work for more than a few thousand years. The Sahara Desert has a prevailing wind pattern. The wind almost always blows the same direction. This causes the desert to grow. The process is called desertification. They did an in-depth study of the Sahara Desert and came to the conclusion that the Sahara Desert is probably about 4,000 years old. So the desert started growing about 4,000 years ago. If the Earth is millions of years old, why is there not a bigger desert somewhere? Why would the biggest desert on the planet be less than 4,000 years old? Well, let's start from the Bible and see if we can figure this thing out. The Bible says that 6,000 years ago, God created everything. 4,400 years ago, there was a worldwide flood. It's pretty hard to have a desert under a worldwide flood. So I predict that the oldest desert should be less than 4,400 years old. And it is. Again, God's word is truth. Sometimes when they drill into the ground, they hit oil. And these oil wells can have up to 20,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. That is a lot of pressure. 20,000 psi. The people that have studied this have concluded that the rock can only hold that pressure for about 10,000 years or less. They say it should have cracked the rock and leaked off in less than 10,000 years. So now I have two questions. Where did the oil come from, and why is it still under pressure? Most scientists agree that oil comes from organisms that are changed by heat and pressure, turning them into oil, and it does not take millions of years to make oil. In 1971, they learned how to make oil in 20 minutes in the laboratory. In 1996, a proposal was approved in Western Australia that would build a plant to create oil from sewage sludge in just 30 minutes. There's a place in Texas that has turned turkey guts and other waste into oil. They said, we duplicated what Mother Nature does, but what Mother Nature took millions of years to do, we do in about 30 minutes. The Sinclair Gas and Oil Company uses the dinosaur as their logo. They say dinosaurs turned into oil, mellowed for 80 million years. I don't think so. Again, let's start with the Bible and see what really happened. 6,000 years ago, God created everything. 4,400 years ago, there was a worldwide flood. During that flood, lots of animals and people drowned. They got buried by the gravel, rocks, and mud and sand, which got pretty heavy after a while, and eventually they were squished into oil. So the oil that is down there today is from the people and animals that drowned and got buried in the flood of Noah's day. Wood petrifies quickly. Here's some petrified firewood. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. It does not take millions of years to give birth. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. Here is a picture of the oldest tree on the planet. It is called the bristlecone pine. Now, tree ring dating is not an exact science. Trees often produce more than one ring each year. But this textbook says the oldest tree in the world is 4,300 years old. Now, that is a pretty old tree. However, I have a question. If the Earth is billions of years old, why don't we have an older tree someplace? Why is the oldest tree 4,300 years old? Here is a picture of a coral reef. The largest coral reef in the world is off the coast of Australia and is called the Great Barrier Reef. Some of the reef was destroyed during World War II by warships and things like that. Afterwards, some environmentalists studied the reef to see how fast it grows back. They watched it grow for 20 years. After watching it grow for 20 years, they came to the conclusion that the reef is less than 4,200 years old. If the Earth is billions of years old, why don't we have a bigger reef someplace? And why is the oldest coral reef less than 4,200 years old? When it rains, 30% of the water runs into the ocean, bringing with it mineral salts. The oceans are getting saltier every day. Today, they are 3.6% salt. They could have gone from fresh water to 3.6% salt in less than 5,000 years. If the Earth were millions or billions of years old, the oceans would be much more saltier. If you have ever been in a cave, the guide always says, don't touch the formations because they take millions of years to form. They say this formation in New Mexico started 250 million years ago. I don't think so. Some say that the fastest they can grow are 2.5 inches per 1,000 years. Again, I don't think so. Here are some 50-inch stalactites growing under the Lincoln Memorial that was built in 1922. The photo was taken in the 1960s, so this happened in only about 40 years. It didn't take millions of years. Here's a bat covered with flowstone before it could even rot. Here's a picture of a guy in a building in Indiana that has huge cave formations in the basement from where the water had been leaking through the limestone. The picture was taken only 40 years after the building was built. Here's a picture from a mine in Australia. The mine was closed for 55 years, and when they went back in, there were these huge cave formations inside that only took 55 years to form. Again, it did not take millions of years for these things to happen. Did you know that at the current rate of erosion, the continents would erode flat in 14 million years? Obviously, the continents have not eroded flat, so the Earth cannot be millions of years old. Erosion features all over the Earth show there was much greater erosion in the past, probably from Noah's flood. The whole world was destroyed by Noah's flood. Here we have the Grand Canyon. This textbook says over millions of years, the Colorado River has carved out the Grand Canyon from solid rock. This textbook says the Colorado River has cut through layer upon layer of rock over millions of years. I don't think so. If a dam were built across Grand Canyon, a large lake would form. In fact, right after the flood of Noah's day, there used to be two huge lakes there, Grand Lake and Hopi Lake. The lakes are long gone, but the beaches are still there. You can still see the beach line. They got too full, went over the top, and washed out that canyon relatively quickly. That canyon is a washed out spillway. So no, it did not take millions of years for the Grand Canyon to form. It formed quickly, just after the flood.
A question that I very frequently get asked, I would say every single week I go speak, which is 52 weeks a year now for 16 years. Every single week somebody will say, now Hovind, how do we see stars billions of light years away? You say the Earth is only 6,000 years old. How do we see the stars? Yesterday on the radio program, on the website, Dr. Dino, some guy called in and said, now, Hovind, I did some studies, and in a 6,000 light year radius, we'd only have so many cubic miles, and all the stars wouldn't fit. I said, wait. Who said anything about a 6,000 mile radius? He said, well, you're the one that said the universe is only 6,000 years old. Yes, I did. But I did not say all the stars are within a 6,000 light year radius. I never said that. That would be ludicrous. How do we see the stars billions of light years away if the universe is only 6,000 years old? And I believe the Bible clearly teaches it's only 6,000 years old. And God made everything. Actually, He made the earth first in Genesis 1, and then verse 14, He made the stars also. Evolution says He made the stars evolve first and then the earth. Well, there's certainly a lot of stars out there. Nehemiah chapter 9 says, Thou, even Thou art Lord alone. Thou hast made the heaven of heavens. God is claiming that He made them. So, either He did or He didn't. But what about the stars? How do they fit in? Astronomers can see a star blow up about every 30 years. It's not like it's on a timetable. It might be every 5 years, might be every 50 years, but on an average, every 30 years, a star explodes. And they're looking out there with their telescope and say, oh, wow, there's a new one. A star exploded. It's called a nova. Or if it's a big one, they call it a supernova. Stars blow up every 30 years. Well, they've searched the heavens with these telescopes looking for how many supernova rings are there. They call it a dead star. Or they can find less than 300. Now, wait a minute. If there are less than 300 supernova rings, and one happens every 30 years, you can do the math. I mean, that's about 9,000 years. If the universe is billions of years old, there ought to be a whole lot more supernova rings out there. Why are there less than 300 supernova rings? Because it's less than 10,000 years old? Boy, they don't like that answer at all. But that's the logical conclusion. If stars are blowing up every 30 years, we would have to have at least one star born every 30 years just to keep the balance. I mean, countries that have a population problem because they're getting less births and deaths, like Germany, more people are dying than being born. Oh, well, eventually that's going to create a problem, okay? Stars should have to be born. Nobody's ever seen one star form. Not one. We see them blow up all the time. They've never seen a star form, and I'll cover that in a second. Its last estimate by Hubble telescope was that there are 70 sextillion stars. 70 sextillion. They say the universe is 20 billion years old. Well, you can do the math. That means 6.5 million stars would have to form every minute. We'd have to have 6.5 million stars forming every minute for 20 billion years to make the stars that we know about. It doesn't count the ones we don't know about because we can't see them yet. Who knows how many stars are out there? Sometimes the textbooks will say, well, there are new stars being constantly born in clouds of gas and dust. This is so stupid. How a physics textbook can teach this, I don't know. Anybody that knows freshman physics knows when you try to squeeze gases together, pressure builds up, temperature builds up, and it drives them back apart. It's called Boyle's gas law. Nobody has ever seen dust collapsing into a solid. It would take such incredible pressure to do that. I was in a debate one time, and this professor, I asked him, I said, how can you get dust to collapse into a solid? Explain that to me. He said, well, we calculated that if 20 stars explode near each other, it'll produce enough pressure to make a brand new star. I said, now that's brilliant. You got to lose 20 to gain 1. I said, you ought to run for Congress. You could help those guys borrow their way out of debt, you know. It's not going to get a universe full of stars if you got to lose 20 to gain 1. And even that is only theoretical. It's never been observed, okay? One guy in Science magazine admitted, the silent embarrassment of modern astrophysics is we do not know how even a single one of these stars managed to form. Nobody knows how stars can form from dust clouds. No one has unambiguously observed material falling into an embryonic star, which should be happening if the star is truly still forming. And no one has caught a molecular cloud in the act of collapsing. Precisely how a section of interstellar cloud collapses gravitationally into a star, a double or multiple star, or a solar system is still a challenging theoretical problem. Astronomers have yet to find an interstellar cloud in the actual process of collapse. The origin of stars represents one of the most fundamental unsolved problems of contemporary physics. This guy said no one really understands how star formation proceeds. It's really remarkable. Nobody knows how this happens. So if they tell you new stars are forming, you tell them Kent Hovind said they're confused or they're lying, because nobody knows how it happens. There's not even a good theory how you could squeeze dust into a star, and there's certainly no evidence. But here's what happens. They see bright spots appear in the clouds. Not in the clouds, in the dust clouds in space. They look at this Crab Nebula or Eagle Nebula, and they're staring at it, and all of a sudden one day a spot gets a little brighter. Oh wow, a star's being born. That's immediately their conclusion that a star is being born. I said, wait. Maybe the dust in front of it is clearing and the star was already there. Maybe it's a star blowing up. Maybe it's another supernova. Because that's what happens when stars supernova, they get really bright. They don't know that a star is forming. So don't let them tell you that we've seen stars form. Nobody has seen such a thing. All we do is we see them blow up, which is the opposite of what evolutionists need. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 1, let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years, and He made the stars also. Here God is claiming He made the stars, and it says in Psalm, He counts the number of the stars. Not only how many there are total, but each one has its own number. So God will say, oh, this is star number 42 trillion, 718 billion. He knows the number of each one. And it says, praise Him, ye waters that be above the heavens in Psalm 148. This is the only verse that says anything like this, waters that be above the heavens. Now in Genesis 1, it talks about verse 6 and 7, water that be above the heavens. I believe when God first made the world, it was very, very different than what we see. Mostly land, instead of the huge oceans that we now have. Most of that water was in the crust of the earth. We covered that in video 2. But there was earth and there was heaven, singular. King James is the only Bible I'm aware of that gets it right in Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. All the rest of them say heavens. Okay, that's a mistake. There was heaven, which means expanded place. There was earth, and then from here, on out. Then He divides it up into 3 slices. First heaven, second heaven, third heaven. The first heaven is where the birds fly. Genesis 1 talks about that, verse 20 and 21. Then there was water above the firmament. But I believe there was a layer of air for Adam to breathe, layer of water above to protect him, and then a layer of stars, and then more water. Could there be a third layer where God lives? Of course, God doesn't need a place to live. He just is, Psalm 29 says, the voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The Lord is upon many waters. The Psalm 148, the waters that be above the heavens, people have often asked, hey, where's the last star? And once we find it, what's on the other side? I don't know the answers to those, but just a possibility is that there, according to the Bible, may still be water above the heavens. But there's a lot of stars out there. Hubble estimate was 11 trillion stars per person. That is 76 trillion divided by 6 billion people. Every one of you gets 11 trillion stars. What happened, they told the Hubble telescope to focus in on a dot. They found a dot above the Big Dipper. It's about the size of a grain of sand, held at arm's length. And it was black. They said, we don't think there's any stars there. Let's focus in on that spot and see what we can find. They took pictures for 10 days straight, focusing in on that dot. After 10 days, there were more stars in that dot than they could count. These were brand new stars, never been seen before. Called it deep field, Hubble Deep Field. Looking up there saying, man, that's stuff we didn't know about. Assumption would be that it's that way all through space. Truly, the stars cannot be numbered, which is what the Bible says. They cannot be numbered. But how do you tell the distance to the stars, and how can the Earth be 6,000 years old and the stars be so far away? Fair question. Stephen Hawking said, stars are so far away, they appear to be just pinpoints of light. We cannot see their size or shape. How do we tell different types of stars apart? For the vast majority, there's only one thing we can see, and that is the color of their light. If you get the biggest telescope on Earth, this is not it, by the way, spotting scope, but if you get the largest telescope on Earth and look at the closest star, which is Alpha Centauri, 4.5 light years away, all you're going to see is a dot. If I focus this in on the sun, it'll start to get, bigger and bigger, and you can actually see flames leaping off and see the spicules, and you can see color changes, and you can actually see features of the sun. When you look at a star, you never get to see that. Nobody has ever seen a star as far as any of the features of it. You get the biggest telescope on Earth, it's going to be nothing but a dot in your scope. All you can tell is, I said, that's a red one, that's a yellow one, that's a blue one, that's all you can see. So anything we do, we have to do based on assumptions just from the color. But how do you tell the distance to the star? Well, I taught high school trig for years, and if you guys had trig, you know how it works. If you have 2 observation points, you can calculate the third distance. You have to know it. It's solving a triangle. Trigonometry deals with triangles, so you sine, cosine, tangent. If you know one distance and 2 angles, or two distances and 1 angle, you can calculate the rest of the triangle using sine, cosine, tangent. Here's the problem. Earth is only 8,000 miles in diameter, which compared to star distance is 0. It's nothing. So if I'm looking at a star and somebody over in China is looking at a star, we are 8,000 miles away from each other, straight line through the Earth. That would be nothing. What they've done to enlarge the distance to look at a star, instead of just being opposite sides of the Earth is also going around the sun in this great big huge circle. We're going 66,000 miles an hour, and it takes us a year to go around. Great big racetrack. Well, the distance from the Earth to the sun is about 93 million miles, average. And that's a lot, but at the speed of light, it's not much. At the speed of light, it's 8 minutes away. It takes the sunlight 8 minutes to get to the Earth. So if we're 8 light minutes from the sun, the diameter of our orbit going around is 16 light minutes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a star in January, and then we're going to look at the star in June, and we have now gone halfway around this monster circle. And we're going to get 2 observation points to try to enlarge the base of our triangle. And it sounds huge. Man, that's 186 million miles. Well, it's still not much. A year has 525,000 minutes in a year. If this picture here showing the little yellow dot was the scale, if that yellow dot represented Earth's orbit, not the Earth's diameter, the orbit of the Earth, it's way too big for the picture. What we're going to do is try to show you the math involved here. If I had 2 surveyors setting up with their transits or telescopes, and they are 16 inches away from each other, and they're both looking at a dot 525,000 inches away, which is 8 1/3 miles. Would you agree that would make a rather skinny triangle? Let's go out in the parking lot and draw a triangle with point A and point B 16 inches apart, and point C 8 1/3 miles away. It's going to make a real skinny triangle. That is exactly the triangle you get when 2 people on opposite sides of Earth's orbit try to measure 1 light year. 1. Now, and I'm not sure you can tell exactly where you were 6 months ago. I think that would be a little stretch of the imagination to say, oh yeah, 6 months ago in January we were, where were we? I'll give them that. I won't even argue that. I just would bring that up, for appeal, Your Honor, in case we need to. You can't know exactly where you were 6 months ago. But the angle you get with that is 0.017 degrees. Now let's imagine this. I want you to get 2 guys to set up their surveying transits. They're 16 inches apart, and I'm going to go put a dot 8 1/3 miles away, but they don't know how far away it is. They're both focusing in on the dot, and they see this dot out there. Here's the only information they have. The measurement between themselves, 16 inches, and the angle out of parallel. I say, guys, I want you to calculate how far away that dot is based on that little angle change you get. I think that would be difficult to measure, 1 light year. There'd be some guesswork involved, okay? Now, if you want to measure 100 light years, you got a much worse problem. Now you got to move your dot 830 miles away. If we had 2 guys on the roof of this building here in Pensacola, Florida, 16 inches apart, and they're both focusing on a dot in Chicago, which is 830 miles away, but they don't know how far away it is, they're going to tell me how far away it is, based only on their angle of their telescope out of parallel. I would say that's impossible. Impossible. To measure 15 billion, no question that's impossible. I don't think you can measure 100 light years, not with real numbers, not with real measurements, but this textbook says they can measure, parallax trigonometry can measure up to 100 light years. Okay, I doubt it, but I'll give them 100. I'll give them 1,000 if they quit crying, okay? The fact is you can't measure a billion. Simple fact. So here's some things to consider about starlight. It said in 2004 that the new SIM technology, Space Interferometry Mission, They hope to get where they can improve the distance of measuring to stars. And they say this accuracy will enable SIM to determine stellar distances to 10% accuracy out to a distance of 482,000 million miles. That's 82,000 light years. And then it says, this is an improvement of several hundred times over what is possible today. Well, now wait a minute. If they're going to improve it several hundred times, and it ends up being 82,000, what's 82,000 divided by several hundred comes out to be several hundred. Apparently they're admitting they can only measure several hundred light years, which I would agree. I mean, I would say that's even a stretch, but I'll give them several hundred. They can't measure billions, is the point. So when you students in school get taught, oh, that star's, 14.629, billion light years away, I don't believe you. I don't believe you at all. It might be, but you can't prove that. They're making up a story. With SIM technology, they hope to finally be able to get out to where they can measure most of the way across our galaxy, and we're in it. We can't even measure across our own galaxy, let alone these distances to other galaxies. So I think we should look at the stars and say, wow, what a mighty God we serve. Instead of going out there and say, well, we know how far that way it is, we know it evolved. I mean, it's just that egotistical attitude some of these atheists get. Makes you want to slap them in the face like, man, why don't you serve God? Look what he made, Here's the things to consider concerning starlight. We cannot measure these great distances. It just cannot be done. Number two, nobody knows what light is. They call it a wave or a photon or a particle. We know what it does. We use it all the time. But actually, give me a jar of it and paint it red. Nobody knows the substance of it. What is light? And we sure don't know that it always travels the same speed all through time or space. The entire theory behind a black hole is that light can be attracted by gravity. Well, if light can be attracted by gravity, then you cannot say the speed of light is a constant, okay? At Harvard University back in '99, they slowed light down to 38 miles an hour. The next year, they slowed it down to 1 mile an hour, and the next year brought it to a dead stop. Light goes, pretty quick, 186,000 miles a second. They slowed it down. It was done at Harvard, it was done at Smithsonian, it was done at Cambridge University, a repeatable, demonstrable experiment. Now that is science. If you do an experiment, get a result, somebody else follows your data, does the same experiment, gets the same result, that's science. They slowed light down. This article came out on Fox News Channel. They said, we've succeeded in holding a light pulse still. They brought the speed of light to zero, brought it to a dead stop. Meanwhile, back in 2000 at Princeton University, they speeded light up to 300 times the speed of light. So when somebody says that star's 10 billion light years away, which I doubt they can measure, therefore that we can prove the universe is 10 billion years old, they got several problems in their logic right away that they probably don't see, which is why we do these seminars, so we can help people understand. It's 300 times the speed of light. Astronomer Barry Setterfield, an Australian government astronomer, said during the last 300 years, 164 measurements of the speed of light have been published using 16 different measurement techniques. The speed of light has apparently decreased so rapidly experimental error cannot explain it. This is a chart showing the decline in the speed of light from the published numbers in the last 150 years. You notice the decline in the chart. The speed of light's getting slower until about 1960. For the last 40 years, anybody that's measured the speed of light gets the same number, 186,282.4, I think, miles per second. Who cares? Well, it could be that it leveled off in 1960 for three possible reasons. Our way of measuring is getting better. Instruments are getting better. We're smarter. Everybody in the past was dumb. We're smart. We got it right. Could be. That's what they'll tell you. Second option, though, is we're at the tail end of a logarithmic curve, and you're much less likely to see any decline. As you get further out on the logarithmic curve, it pretty much levels out. But a third reason is 1956 is when they invented the atomic clock. And they started using that as their clock to measure the speed of light. Well, now, wait. The atomic clock is based on the wavelength of a cesium-133 atom. So the clock is based on the speed of light. Now, if you have a clock based on the speed of light and you're measuring the speed of light with it, if the speed of light changes, you're never going to catch it with that clock. It's like watching two twins grow next to each other. Well, neither one's growing. Well, duh. You got a rubber ruler problem here. Clear back in '87, they said the speed of light was 10 billion times faster at time zero. There must have been a faster speed of light. There have been articles from the 80s, 90s, 2000s saying, look, the speed of light is not a constant. They said no physical law prevents anything from exceeding the speed of light. In 2 published experiments, the speed of light was apparently exceeded by as much as a factor of 100. The Big Bang Theory requires a much faster speed of light. Dr. Magluelcio, however you pronounce his name here, I got his book on the table. He says the shocking possibility is the speed of light might change in time during the life of the universe. Could it be the speed of light was faster? There's an article in the newspaper said speed of light may have changed over history. Study says. Winnipeg Free Press, nothing's reliable, not even the speed of light. We have shown that a time-varying speed of light could provide a resolution to well-known cosmological puzzles. One of the mysteries of a decaying speed of light seems to be able to explain Why opposite extremes of the cosmos that are too far apart to have been in contact with each other appear to obey the same rules of physics, and even about the same temperatures. It would only be possible for light to cross from one side to the other if it traveled much faster than today, moments after the universe was created. Is the speed of light really a constant? There are articles here in Reuters News Service, the speed of light may not be a constant. I have dozens of articles like this in the last 15 years, and this will be much more detail in our college class about the speed of light. So don't let somebody tell you the speed of light is a constant. We don't know that. Big article came out in Discover magazine, says, was Einstein wrong about the speed of light back in 2000? He said, yeah, Einstein was wrong. The speed of light is not a constant. There's the book by the Italian scientist, I'm assuming he's Italian. It says, look, the speed of light is not a constant. And there have been many articles published about this. You can read them for yourself. I'll flash through them quickly here and you can get the details. So the third thing to consider, the creation was finished when God made it. Not only can we not measure those distances, not only is the speed of light not necessarily a constant, the creation was done. See, Jesus made wine out of grapes that never existed. He missed all that time. Instead of going from the water in the ground, through the plant, into the grape, squeeze it, make the wine, now drink it. No, Jesus turned the water straight to wine. What happened to all the intermediate steps? God can bypass all that. He doesn't need any of that. Okay? I ask people the question, how old was Adam on day 6? Anybody know? How old was Adam on day 6? 0. Did he look 0? No. God didn't make 2 babies and put them in the Garden of Eden and hand them a package of seeds and say, here, plant these quick, you're going to need supper. It has to be a full-grown man, full-grown woman, full-grown garden. They got to have supper like tonight, you know. Better be something hanging on the tree ready to eat. Even if you plant a tree, you're going to take 4 or 5 years to get fruit off it. So the creation had to be mature. A fourth thing to consider about the speed of light question. A light year is a distance. It's not a time. It's a distance. And since the speed of light is not proven to be consistent, why would star distance have anything to do with the age of the universe? Now, I am not saying, and have never said, all of the stars are inside of a 6,000-mile radius of the Earth. That is not what I say. I don't know any creationist that teaches that. So when they say that, they're setting up a straw man, you know, knocking it down. They're lying, basically. The stars probably are billions of light years away. They probably are. We just can't measure them, that's all. I like this article in the Discovery. It said, how do scientists measure the age of stars? They said, well, we can find the absolute ages by comparing a star's color and brightness with those in stellar evolution models. What? We can tell how old it is by how old we think it is. That's exactly what they're saying right there. That's dumb, okay? Genesis chapter 1 says, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Well, what is a firmament? Some people say it must be the dirt, you know, because the dirt keeps the water away from the water. No, it's not the dirt. Read down to verse number 20, and it says, the fowls, that's the birds, fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. The birds fly in the firmament. The birds do not fly in the dirt. Okay, the birds fly in the air. So the first heaven is telling us right here is where the birds fly. Okay? The Scripture interprets itself. Second heaven is where the sun, moon, and stars are. God said, let there be lights in the firmament. Talks about the sun, moon, and stars. That's the second heaven. The third heaven is only mentioned once in the Bible, right here, 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 3 heavens mentioned in the Bible. First heaven where the birds fly, second heaven where the stars are, third heaven where God lives. Psalm 19 talks about the heavens, plural, declare the glory of God. Heavens. Remember Genesis 1:1, it's heaven singular. Then he divides it up into 3 slices. First heaven, second heaven, third heaven. Heavens declare the glory of God. Verse 7 says, God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. Now wait a minute. Is he telling us there was water above where the birds fly? Psalm 148 says, praise him, ye waters that be above the heavens. 2 Peter tells us, the earth was standing out of the water and in the water. Apparently, when God first made the earth, there was a canopy of water or ice above the atmosphere. It's not there now. It all fell down at the time of the flood. But Isaiah tells us, the Lord sits on the circle of the earth. Interesting. 3,000 years ago, the Bible said the earth is round. Christians have never taught the earth is flat. Some heathens have believed that and tried to blame it on the Christians, but we've always known the earth is round. But then it says, he stretched out the heavens. 17 times in the Bible it says he stretches out the heavens. Maybe that's why we have a red shift in astronomy. And people say, how did the light get from the stars to here? Oh, you got it all backwards. The Bible says God made the earth first and then the stars. So the question is, how did the stars get from here to there? Not how did the light get from there to here? But he stretched out the heavens. Interesting. Today's atmosphere that we're breathing has 6 layers. Troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, and ionosphere. There used to be a 7th layer. It was a layer of water or ice above the atmosphere. I don't know what it was because it's gone now, okay? All we can do is make a theory about it. This is called the canopy theory, which says there was a layer of water or ice, probably ice, above the atmosphere. I happen to believe it's probably 10 or 20 inches of ice, super cold ice, suspended by the magnetic field. You know how a magnet can float on top of another magnet? It's called the Meissner effect. The Earth could have had a canopy of ice suspended in the magnetic field, which would float it above the Earth. This ice or water would block out UV light, some of it. It would increase air pressure. Today, the air is about 100 miles thick. It would squeeze it all down probably to 10 or 20 miles and double the air pressure on the surface. By the way, when the space shuttle blasts off and leaves all that exhaust behind, it's forming ice clouds, and the ice clouds float to the North and South Pole and hover there about 50 miles above the Arctic. Ice clouds that are floating, they won't fall. Apparently stuck in the magnetic field, I don't know. Josephus wrote in his book that the Hebrews believed when God made the earth on the second day, he placed a crystalline firmament around it. A crystalline firmament, probably super cold ice. Okay? There was not only a canopy of water above the earth, there was water in the crust of the earth. Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's. He founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. See, most of the water that's now in the oceans used to be in the crust of the earth. Psalm 136 says he stretched out the earth above the waters. It's not the way it is today. Better read that verse very carefully. That's given us a powerful clue of what the original creation was like. The Bible says there was not only the earth, but there was water in the crust of the earth, under the crust of the earth, actually. Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's, he founded it upon the seas. That's an interesting verse. The earth was built on top of the water. Psalm 133, he gathereth the waters of the sea together as an heap, he layeth up the depth in storehouses. What today is in the oceans on the surface used to be in the crust of the earth, stored up in big subterranean chambers. And then the fountains of the deep broke open. The water that used to be in the crust went shooting to the surface when the fountains of the deep broke open. The Bible says in Job 38, who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, when it issued out of the womb? Well, I tell you what, if you've never seen a baby born, when the water comes breaking out of the womb, it is an amazing process. One of my friends was in college, his wife was standing there, and her water broke. Just like she wet her pants all over the floor. Her husband came running in. What happened? What happened? He slipped and broke his arm, and she had to drive him to the hospital to get his arm set. What a mess when babies are born. I delivered one of my kids at home, and when the water issues out of the womb, it is a royal mess. And he's telling us here in the book of Job, God is talking here in chapter 38, when the water issued out of the earth, it just burst out of the earth. And it says, and goes on and says, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. And here shall thy proud waves be stayed. I believe the earth broke up at the time of the flood, and we still have the scars all over the planet where this happened. They're called fault lines.
Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust, just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settle out of this muddy water all over the earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
That is Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which to me makes the most sense of anything I've seen. It explains several things. If the crack would widen around the mid-Atlantic ridge as the water is shooting out, it's going to spread out, allowing the basalt underneath to bulge up, which is precisely what happens. As the basalt bulges up, it's going to get cracks in it, and it's also going to slide the superimposing plates away from them. They're going to slide and run into something else, and it would explain the compressed mountains we see in, for instance, British Columbia, where the mountains are smashed from the end. I mean, the wrinkles go up and down. The mountain it's like somebody pushed carpet up against the wall, causing it to wrinkle. I think Christians need to have an answer for those kind of things, and this is one of the possible answers. When the basalt cracked, the water would rush into the crack, cooling it down, and cool rock holds a magnetic field. Hot rock will lose a magnetic field. So when they found what they said were magnetic reversals at the bottom of the ocean floor, they're actually finding old cracks where the basalt broke, because there were going to be warmer and cooler areas from simply the water rushing in. Those cracks are probably now all full of sediments. So don't let them tell you there are magnetic reversals. There may be a few from the rocks flipping over at the flood, but I think a much better theory is the hydroplate theory. So as the continents were sliding away, some places are going to be sucked under, plate subduction. Now Baumgartner has a great theory on plate subduction. I think his ties in here also. The plates would tend to be sucked down. You ever stir pudding up and it gets a film on top? If you push in on the film on the pudding, it'll sink to the bottom and drag the rest of it with it. Magma does the same thing from a volcano. When it cools down, the lava gets a hard crust, and then if it sinks in one place, it'll drag a whole sheet of lava with it. This probably happened also during the flood. The continents are eroding. When it rains, you have landslides, mudslides, erosion, mass wasting, ground creep. All of those things are happening continually. This mud is going to wash into the ocean. So two things are happening. The mountains are getting shorter. The oceans are filling in. But at the current rate of erosion, the continents are going to erode flat in 14 million years. So the evolutionists have a serious problem. They have to explain two things. Why aren't the oceans full of mud? Because there's only a few thousand years worth of mud in the oceans. And why haven't the mountains eroded away yet? That's why this Pangea theory is so important to them, because they can say, oh, it's being recycled. They'll say the ocean floor doesn't have much mud because it gets pulled under and remelted and it comes up again in the middle. So it's being recycled. Well, that may be, but there's another reason. It may be there's not much mud down there because it's not millions of years old. Plates are moving, there's not much question about that. But that doesn't prove they've always been moving, and it doesn't prove the rate has always been the same as we see today. I think students should be told there are other options than what they're being taught in school. Don't fall for that propaganda.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages.
People say, where does the Ice Age fit into the Bible? There certainly was an Ice Age. There's not much question. Ice came all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. How many of you are from Ohio or Indiana or Michigan or Minnesota or one of these states that are covered by ice? They used to be covered by ice, okay? Actually, this time of year, they're still covered by ice. There's all kinds of evidence around those states that you can prove there really was an Ice Age. When ice pushes out, it piles up a pile of rocks in front of it. When the rocks are left there, when the ice melts back, it's called a terminal moraine. If it pushes the rocks to the side, it's called a lateral moraine. When the ice melts back, it leaves behind lakes called kettle lakes. Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, is full of kettle lakes. As the ice melts back, the ground actually lifts up because the weight is gone. The ground may lift up quite a ways. That's called isostatic rebound. There is no question Those things actually happen. The question for the Christian is, where does this fit into the Bible? And what froze the mammoths? Some of the big, hairy, hippie elephants that are found frozen standing up, food still in their teeth. What happened to the mammoths? One year, it was reported that 20,000 mammoth tusks were extracted from the ground. Just 1 year. 20,000 tusks. Estimates are that 5 million mammoths perished in one catastrophe. These red dots indicate where frozen mammoths have been found. The yellow dots indicate where frozen rhinoceros have been found. What happened to the mammoths? Well, some of the mammoths are frozen in the upright position. Their undigested food in their stomach and mouth is an interesting situation. They died of suffocation. There's no water found in the lungs. The small ice crystals in the blood indicate they probably froze in less than 5 hours. That requires something less than 300 below zero. Now, it never gets 300 below zero on Earth. The coldest temperature ever recorded from National Geographic is minus 127 degrees. That's pretty chilly, but that's not cold enough to freeze the mammoths. What happened to freeze the mammoths? In 1999, I was preaching in Alaska, and I took the little tour to out on a boat to see the Portage Glacier, and I'm standing next to this guy on the boat. I got talking to him, trying to witness to him. I said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "Well, I drill for oil in Barrow, Alaska, near Barrow, Alaska." I said, "Well, when you drill down, do you find anything interesting down there?" He said, "You wouldn't believe the stuff we drill into down there." He said, "Just a few months ago, we were drilling down. We drilled through 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground called permafrost, and we started bringing up pieces of wood. And we always take whatever comes out of the well and lay it out on the ground so we can get a core sample of what we're drilling through to know the formation." He said, "We drilled straight through a tree that was standing up. The tree was 300 feet tall, standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground." Well, I preached in Barrow, Alaska a couple years ago. There is only one tree in Barrow, Alaska, and it is about this tall in a Chinese restaurant, and they struggle to keep it alive because they don't get much sun up there for months at a time. There are no trees outside in Barrow, Alaska. There are certainly no trees 300 feet tall. There are very few trees in the world that are 300 feet tall. How do you get a tree 300 feet tall, standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground? What happened? I believe the original creation had a layer of water above, maybe 10 or 20 inches, who knows, of ice probably, and then a layer of air to breathe, probably 10 or 20 miles, I don't know, and then dirt and rocks to stand on, the crust of the earth, which we still have, but inside the crust of the earth, there was water. That's the water that came shooting to the surface when the fountains of the deep broke open. By the way, there is still lots of water in the crust of the earth. Otherwise, you could not have hot water vents shooting up into the bottom of the ocean. If you have hot water squirting up into the bottom of the ocean, where does it have to be coming from? Lower than that, doesn't it? Still huge hot water vents in the bottom of the ocean. I think some of that water is still coming out. I think the earth today still has cracks where it broke open at the time of the flood. I taught earth science for years. The earth is broken up into plates. There's no question. I've been to the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, the New Madrid Fault, the Golden Fault. There's no question. There are cracks in the earth's crust, and when they move around, buildings fall down. It's called earthquakes, okay? Or tsunamis happen from the underwater landslides and turbidity currents. There's no question the earth is broken up, and there's no question the plates are still moving. The question is, when did all this happen? Now, the evolutionist will tell you this happened over millions and millions of years. The creationist says, no, all this catastrophe probably started at the time of that flood when the fountains of the deep broke open. That's what caused the fault lines. And the water went shooting to the surface, and it's still here today. I was debating an atheist one time, and during Q&A time, a student stood up and said, "Hovind, where'd all the water from the flood go?" I said, "Oh, it's still here." I said, "The oceans are huge. There's enough water in the oceans, if you smoothed out the earth, it would cover the earth 1.5 miles deep everywhere." These hot water vents are proof there's water in the crust of the earth still squirting up. Probably most of it's gone now, it's on the surface. But this canopy of water that used to be there in the original creation would make the whole earth like a big greenhouse. How many know what a greenhouse is? They've got all glass walls. You have to dress in the basement if you live in a greenhouse. Well, scientists are still finding lots of water in space between the stars. There's lots of water out in space. Interesting. Cover more on that later. And they've got a new theory now that says maybe a lack of oxygen killed the dinosaurs. A lack of oxygen. Why would they say that? Well, they had a big symposium in 1993. A bunch of scientists got together to study the apatosaurus. And they said, folks, we've got a problem. An 80-foot apatosaurus had nostrils the same size as a horse. How is an 80-foot animal going to get enough air through nostrils the same size as a horse? He'd be sucking so hard trying to get a breath, it set them on fire from the friction from the wind whistling in there. They couldn't breathe. Well, apparently they did breathe because bones of dinosaurs are found all over the planet, even in Antarctica and Alaska. I mean, dinosaurs lived everywhere, okay? So how could an 80-foot animal get enough air? Well, today he probably couldn't, not to get 80 feet long. But I think before the flood came, they had this canopy of air or of water or ice that would increase air pressure. Plus, they had richer oxygen. You know, when they drill into the amber, how many saw the movie Jurassic Park, you know, where they drilled in to get the mosquito blood out? Sometimes in amber, which is petrified tree sap, they find air bubbles in the amber. When they analyze the air bubbles, they find out they're 50% more oxygen than we have today. Today, we're breathing 21% oxygen. Amber bubbles have 32% oxygen. Did you know if you lived in a world with double the air pressure and 50% more oxygen, just breathing would be exciting? Adam would go, wow. That was fun. Hey, Eve, let's do that again. Ready, go. The earth had more oxygen in the past than it does now. Now, you kids are going to be told in textbooks that the earth had no oxygen at the beginning when life was evolving, called a reducing atmosphere. That is baloney. If you double the air pressure and increase oxygen, not only does your hemoglobin take on oxygen like it's supposed to, your plasma will get oxygen saturated, which means you could run hundreds of miles without getting tired. Adam and Eve didn't need a car. They could run to grandma's. Only they didn't have a grandma, or mother-in-law, by the way. That's why it was paradise. Actually, my wife had a great mother-in-law. But I think before the flood came, I think things were a whole lot different. With increased oxygen, you would heal up much faster. A lot of hospitals are getting these hyperbaric chambers. Does UT Medical Center have a hyperbaric chamber? They do? You know how big it is? Does it 1 or 2 or 3 person or 1 person? Okay. West Germany is treating stroke patients with hyperbaric oxygen, getting incredible recovery from strokes. In England, they're treating multiple sclerosis. They treat all kinds of diseases with hyperbaric chambers. In India, they're treating leprosy, getting incredible results. Here's a kid being treated for cerebral palsy with hyperbaric oxygen. Doctors have discovered if they add more oxygen during surgery when the person's under anesthetic, only half as many patients get infections and only half as many people get nauseated, just by giving the sleeping patient more oxygen. Interesting. There's a chamber in New York that treats autism with hyperbaric oxygen. Hyperbaric therapies use as healing tool grows, article says. Here's a single-person chamber. Did you know the Dallas Cowboys have a hyperbaric chamber? Why would professional sports teams want a hyperbaric chamber? Well, because they've discovered their injured players will heal twice as fast. See, if you're paying the guy $1,000 a minute to go play with a ball, you want him out there playing with the ball. Okay, earning his $1,000 a minute or whatever they get. Here's a Zach, somebody from the Dolphins, says, about 3 times a week during the season, Zach chills out for an hour or so in a hyperbaric chamber, a 12-by-4 bag inflated with pure oxygen that helps the body heal and promotes a feeling of well-being. You can get your own hyperbaric sleeping bag if you want. A friend of mine in Oregon has a hyperbaric chamber. Here's my son running the camera back there, and his wife and I at an oxygen bar in Alaska. Not a bar where you drink alcohol. I've never had alcohol in my life, okay? But you sit down to eat lunch, and you breathe pure oxygen. You pay them $5, and you breathe pure oxygen while you're eating lunch. And when you get done, you feel like going shopping again. It's a conspiracy, I can tell you right now. The whole thing's a conspiracy to get you to spend more money, okay? But then you feel great. My friend in Oregon has a hyperbaric chamber. I was out there. He said, Brother Hovland, would you like to try it? I said, yeah. He put me in there, gave me a book to read, said, I'm going to shut the door and pump it up to triple normal pressure. They use the diving terms. You're going to dive to 90 feet. Well, you're sitting right there in the chamber. You don't go anywhere, but it's like scuba diving to 90 feet. He said, now, I'll let you out in about an hour. I was in there breathing pure oxygen for an hour, reading my book, under triple normal pressure. When he let me out, he said, how do you feel? I said, I feel like running around the world. This is incredible. Now, how many of you old-timers, your get up and go, done, got up and went? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Most exciting thing you can think of is taking a nap Sunday afternoon, right? Well, man, in the pre-flood world, if they had to double the air pressure and increased oxygen, you would just be full of energy all the time. There's a guy in Japan started raising tomato plants with pressurized carbon dioxide. You know, plants breathe CO2, not oxygen. His tomato plant grew faster than normal. When it was 2 years old, it was 16 feet tall and produced 900 tomatoes. They moved it to a shopping center and built scaffolding to hold the branches up. They said, you know, this thing might produce 10,000 tomatoes. This is one tomato plant. It ended up growing 40 feet tall and producing 15,000 tomatoes off one plant. It was a cherry tomato plant, but tomatoes were coming off baseball size off of his. A guy in Iowa got curious, you know, why do the birds start chirping an hour before sunrise? He found out the chirping of the birds is a certain frequency that opens up the stomata on the leaf cells. You know, the leaf, if you look underneath with a magnifying glass, it's got these little holes in there that open up to let the CO2 come in. That wakes the leaf up in the morning. Well, he discovered that this frequency is found quite a bit in classical music. So he started playing Beethoven and Bach and Chopin to his cornfield. His neighbors thought, you know, un poquito loco a la cabeza, you know. They thought he was nuts until his corn grew 15 feet tall. He played it to his squash plants, and they grew 5 squash per leaf instead of 1. He played it to his black walnut tree, and it grew twice as fast as normal. His potatoes got double or triple normal potato size. His cantaloupe were the size of soccer balls. He called it sonic bloom. There's a good magazine called Creation Illustrated. I've got one on the table down here. There are two Creation magazines, regular Creation magazine, that's a good one, and Creation Illustrated, which you can go to my website, just click on the dot to go to Creation Illustrated. They'll send you a free copy to try it. It's $20 a year if you want to subscribe. But if you go to my website, Dr. Dino, you can click on that and get a free copy. There's an article in there in one of the past issues about this sonic bloom, which is really incredible. It's sitting on the table down here. I debated Jeannie Scott. She's the president of the National Center for Science Education in Berkeley, California. The National Center is a little bitty storefront building with 5 people in there. The National Center for Science Education. But I debated Jeannie Scott in a debate, and she said, Dr. Hovind, there are 80 separate layers of coal in the Midwest. She's right. She said, if you look at the amount of coal in the world today, the entire biomass, all the plants of the world today, could not possibly be converted to that much fossil fuel. She's right again. There is so much coal in the world that if you took every tree and blade of grass and bush and squished it, you couldn't make all the coal. There are enormous volumes of coal in the earth. I said, Jeannie, you are right. She said, well, don't you see, Hovind, there had to be an enormous amount of time to lay down all the coal seams. Oh, no. Right there, she's wrong. You see, she's looking at today's world and assuming that's how it's always been. The coal we find in the ground today is a result of that flood, which buried the world before the flood, when they had lots more trees. There's a coal mine in Montana that is 10,000 square miles of coal up to 200 feet thick. Someone told me a few months ago they've now found a seam 300 feet thick. That's a lot of coal, a lot of coal. And sometimes in coal, human artifacts are found. This bell was found inside a lump of coal. This iron pot was found inside a lump of coal. The sole of a shoe found inside a lump of coal. We cover more on that on video 6 about coal formation. But the Bible says there were herbs, that's plants, over all the earth. It's not that way today. 70% of the earth is underwater, for heaven's sake. Okay, that's not covered with plants. The earth was covered with plants when God made it. Did you know they find leaves in Antarctica? 250 miles from the South Pole, they're finding leaves. There are no trees in the South Pole. 70% of the earth today is underwater. Did you know only 3% of this earth is habitable for mankind? A lot of it's under desert, ice caps, tundra, mountain ranges that nobody can live on. 3% is habitable. What we're seeing today is not what Adam and Eve saw. The Bible says He formed it to be inhabited. That's why He did it. Probably the pre-flood world was, I would just be picking a number and say probably 80% land and only 20% water. The oceans weren't there. The water was in the crust of the earth or in the canopy overhead. There were trees from pole to pole before the flood came. This layer of water above the earth would act as a barrier that would block out UV light and X-rays and other harmful things that come from the sun. See, the sun produces a lot of stuff besides light. It produces X-rays and gamma rays and beta rays, and all them ray boys come down here, and they're pretty hard on your carcass. But a lot of people don't realize the sun X-rays us every day. We're being X-rayed right now. Now, concrete will stop X-rays and water will stop X-rays, but this roof on this church will not stop X-rays. They're coming right through the roof and right through your body. Your skin feels the full force of these X-rays, and your body has to fix the damage. I mean, you fix millions of holes in your skin every single day. Millions of them. And after 50 or 60 years, or 70 or 80 for sure, everybody around you starts to notice you are losing the battle for damage control. Your skin begins to wrinkle up. The Bible says before the flood came, they lived to be over 900 years old and probably didn't wrinkle. One guy is going around, claims he's a creationist. He says, now folks, they didn't really live to be 900. They counted every month as a year. They used a lunar calendar, and you have to divide those numbers by 12. Wow, that's an even bigger miracle. Enoch was 65 when he begat Methuselah. 2 of these guys are 65. Let's see, divided by 12? That makes him 5.5 when he became a daddy. I doubt that real seriously, okay? I'd have a hard time believing that. No, they really were living to be 900, and they got bigger. Here's Me by Robert Wadlow, tallest man in this century, 8 foot 11 1/4, had a size 37 shoe. Pretty big boy, okay? Robert Wadlow would have been just a few inches shorter than Goliath, who was about 9 foot 5 or 6. Robert Wadlow, at age 12, was the world's tallest Boy Scout. Here he is, age 12, with his Boy Scout troop. We would consider that gigantic at almost 9 feet tall, wouldn't we? But I think before the flood, they got even bigger than that. Here's a skeleton of a man 11 foot 6 inches tall. Well, long, not tall. He's laying down now. 11'6". How'd you like to have one of those guys on your basketball team? Well, UT would be the champs from now on, wouldn't he? Tallest man today, it was 8'4" when this picture was taken. I've been told he's now 8'7", living in Ukraine. Pretty good-sized boy. 8'7", big hands. There he is trying to use a cell phone. That'd be tough, wouldn't it? Roman Emperor Maximus was 8'6", 2,000 years ago, where we get our word maximum from. A 9 foot 8 inch skeleton was found in Indiana. 2 skeletons 9 feet tall found in Virginia City. Every skeleton found in this mine in this burial mound in Louisiana, 20 skeletons were found, all of them 9 feet tall. Skeleton 10 feet tall, found in Humboldt Lake, Nevada. And in Guam, they have a legend that the giants used to live on the island of Guam and built these big latte stones over there. In Indiana, 8 giants were found ranging from 8 to 9 feet long wearing heavy copper armor. The museum was not interested in them. Why would a museum not be interested in 9-foot skeletons to put on display? Could it be that there's a theory called evolution which says we started off small and we're getting bigger, which makes us feel important, of course, We're evolving. Ye shall be as gods. You're getting better. Could it be the truth is exactly the opposite? People were much bigger before the flood, and now we're getting worse? And maybe they're trying to hide that? A 12-foot skeleton found in Lompoc Rancho, California. Another 12-footer found in Tucson, Arizona. The guy had 6 toes, 6 fingers, 6 toes, and a bird-shaped headdress. When the Mexicans, Cortez, went to Mexico and conquered part of it, the people who lived there said, oh, there used to be giants that lived on this continent. They brought a bone of one of these guys out. Just the thigh bone was as tall as Cortez. Just the thigh bone. And he said, I'm a man of good size. He said, I'm a good-sized guy, and this was the same size as me. This is a giant block of rock. Who on earth is moving these things? Consider that's a camel in front of it for scale. Who's cutting and moving these things? This is a 39-pound axe head. Swing a 10-pound sledge for a few minutes and see why I'm wondering who's swinging a 39-pound axe head. This is a stone designed to be held between the thumb and finger for chipping. The Smithsonian is responsible for hiding most of the discoveries of giant humans. They don't want people to know about these giants because it goes against the evolution theory. This skull used to be on display in Winnemucca, Nevada until a few years ago when they took it down. It's in the basement. You have to specially ask to see it. A giant human skull. Here's a normal human thumb bone. Underneath is a giant human thumb bone. This is part of a skeleton found at a grave in Turkey right near Mount Ararat. The government of Turkey says they have found the grave of Noah. The skeleton was 12 feet tall. Now that would make his cubit a little bigger, wouldn't it? People say 1 man and 3 boys could never build a boat that size. You didn't see those boys. Hey, Bubba, bring me that tree, would you? Sure, Dad. Where do you want it? We've got a replica of a thigh bone in our museum from a guy that would have been about 13 feet tall. If you meet a guy like that, call him Sir. There's an article on the table all about it down here if you want to read more on this one. These jaw bones are on display at a hotel in Turkey, 6.5 inches across the TMJs. Any one of you could put your head inside the jaw and bounce it around. Waukesha, Wisconsin. They found a human skull 3 times the size of ordinary humans, found in an Indian burial mound. Giants were on the earth in those days. That's what the Bible says. There were giants here. Well, the Bible says we're made in God's image. Now, if we're made in God's image, why do we pay to teach the kids that this is Grandpa? What is the truth about the cavemen? Where do cavemen fit into this picture anyway? I mean, if the Bible's true and the earth's only 6,000 years old, what about the cavemen?
To explain this on a graph, I've already explained that evolutionists believe that all forms of life evolve, meaning that they are adding complexity, they are adding information. This can be depicted by an upward graph. Now, this is all hypothetical. It has never once been proven in a laboratory setting or in the field. What scientists do observe on a regular basis, however, is the recombining of already existent information, meaning no additional complexity being added, which can be represented by a horizontal line. In other words, variations within the same kind of animal, but all resulting from the same genetic information. Nothing added, nothing subtracted. They also occasionally witness mutations that result in the loss of genetic information. This can be represented by a downward slope, or the loss of complexity, the loss of information. Now, sometimes they try and confuse you, and they will point to something that they claim is a beneficial mutation that is actually the result of losing genetic information. But the way that works is an organism losing a protein that a virus or bacteria attacks. Therefore, if the organism no longer produces and creates that protein, this virus that was attacking them is no longer able to. And they credit that as a beneficial mutation when in reality, it is the loss of genetic information and cannot possibly quantify as evolution. If anything, it's de-evolution. Now, when we look at these graphs, we know that the creation of new information has never once been observed, tested, or proven, even possible. The horizontal line accurately depicts no information being added or lost, while still creating variations within the same kind of animal. Now, the downward slope, as I described, explains the loss of genetic information. Now, the thing with this is, you can't continue losing genetic information and still see beneficial mutations. The vast majority of the time, when you lose genetic information, it's a negative thing. So yes, while scientists can occasionally point to the loss of genetic information being a benefit to a particular animal, Not only is that extraordinarily rare, but it actually shows de-evolution. So when we look at this graph and we see what has been proven and what has never been proven, and we look back at these bones of Neanderthal man being uncovered, well, it begins to seem as though we're actually, in a sense, de-evolving. I mean, after all, that is what the science is indicating.
The Bible says in Genesis 1, God said, I'm going to make man in his own image. If we're made in the image of God, why do we teach the kids? Grandpa was an ape. Now, evolution teaches we're getting better and someday we're going to become God. The facts are we're getting worse. Things are falling apart. We now have an incredible genetic load. We are mentally and physically deficient compared to Adam and Eve. Things are not getting better, but we all teach the kids in the textbooks, this is Grandpa. What's the truth about the cavemen? Is it possible for an ape-like creature to turn to a human? Well, it depends what you mean by caveman. Okay, there are people today who live in caves. Okay, we don't call them half ape, half human. There's the world's most wanted caveman right there, Osama bin Laden. There's a former caveman. I think someone's trying to make a monkey out of us. Was your ancestor an ape-like creature? I don't think so. So where does the Stone Age fit into the Bible? Was there ever a Stone Age? Well, right after the flood, Noah couldn't tell his grandson to go to the hardware store and get him a shovel. There were no hardware stores. They had a devastated society, folks. They got off the ark and everything outside is destroyed. You have to totally rebuild civilization. They had a Gilligan's Island situation. They're on this devastated planet. So they're going to have to rebuild from scratch, and you're going to make stone tools because that's much quicker than digging the iron ore out, smelting it down, and making an iron tool. You know, by the time it takes you 3 weeks to make your axe, you're going to starve to death, okay? So they're going to make stone tools. And people that are driven out of society are going to travel around in small herds and packs following migrating animals, and they don't want to carry 50 pounds worth of stone tools with them. It's quicker to make your stone tools on the job site. You follow the mammoths until you catch up with them, or the buffalo, and then you quick make your tools, kill the buffalo or the mammoth, and you butcher it and leave your tools behind and go on someplace else. And then we today find these stone tools and say, wow, look at this Clovis point. Wow, perfectly shaped, perfectly balanced. This guy is smart. This is an advanced civilization. Then they find another arrowhead that looks kind of crude, you know, it's not chipped very smoothly. They say, wow, this guy's pre-human. You're not quite as smart. You know, maybe you got the whole wrong perspective on that. Maybe the one that looks kind of crude was found by a guy who's in a bigger hurry because the mammoth is getting away, okay? He just doesn't have time to sit there and play with his arrowhead for an hour. He wants to go shoot the thing now before it runs off. So it might be an example of how much time they have to spend on it. Not at all an example of their intelligence. All right? But not only were people living longer before the flood, animals were too, and they were growing bigger, probably much bigger. Here's a hornless rhinoceros, 18 feet tall. That's a big rhino. People say that's a prehistoric animal. No, did you know the word prehistoric was not even in the dictionary until about 100 years ago? See, there are things that are pre-flood, but there's no such thing as prehistoric. We have history from the first day. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. You can't go before that. So there's no such thing as prehistoric. But before the flood came, this canopy of water would increase air pressure, which would make things behave very differently. It makes insects grow much bigger. See, insects are limited on size based on the amount of oxygen they can get. Insects that live in oxygen-rich waters get 1,000 times heavier than those that don't. It has to do with the surface area to volume ratio. Without boring everybody for a half hour, the larger an insect gets, it has more skin, but not compared to its volume. The surface area compared to its volume ratio drops off, as you can see on the chart here. So as an insect gets larger, it doesn't have enough skin because insects breathe through their skin. But giant insect fossils have been found, like this dragonfly with a 50-inch wingspan. How'd you like to hit one of those at 70 miles an hour? You take the bug deflector and the hood right off and join you in the front seat. Big dragonflies been found fossilized on this planet. Today they get 4 or 5 inches long, you know, not very big. Pre-flood they were huge. Cockroaches get pretty good size today. We raise them in our museum in Pensacola, the Madagascar hissing cockroaches. But did you know giant cockroaches have been found, 18-inch long cockroach fossils? You didn't call Orkin in those days. You called the National Guard to come exterminate the house, okay? Giant fossil centipede, 8.5 feet long, was found. Grasshoppers, 2 feet long, have been found fossilized. You can make a meal out of those. Tarantula with a 3-foot leg span, fossil. 60-foot cattail fossils have been found. A donkey 9 feet high. Giant sloths obviously lived on the planet. Now you're going to be told that was millions of years ago. No, it wasn't. It was just before the flood came. Buffalo were found with horn spans up to 12 feet. Elk with 12-foot antlers. Fossil kangaroos have been found 10 feet tall. And fossil wombat, the size of a mini. Here's a fossil of a guinea pig that was 1,500 pounds. That's a big guinea pig. Birds have been found 13 feet tall. There's an elephant bird egg. The one behind it's an ostrich egg, which is also huge. They find fossils of prehistoric goose that stood as tall as an elephant and weighed half a ton. How'd you like to have that for Thanksgiving dinner? Tell Tiny Tim about that goose. Yeah. Fossil beavers have been found 8 feet long. Here's a guy holding a beaver jaw from about a 7 or 8 foot beaver. There's a 6-foot beaver found in Ohio. See, if you have bigger trees before the flood, you would need bigger beavers to chew them down. God kept everything balanced in those days. Salamanders today get from 5 to 8 inches long, typically. Did you know fossil salamanders have been found that are 6 feet long? Increasing air pressure means more gas gets into the water, and fish have to breathe in the water through their gills. So if you had more gas dissolved in the water from greater air pressure, now the fish can get bigger, and you can get a lot more fish per cubic mile. Today, if a shark has a tooth about 1 inch long, it indicates the shark was probably about 15 feet long. Did you know fossil sharks' teeth are found indicating sharks used to get 80 feet long on this planet? Can you imagine an 80-foot shark? The movie Jaws had a 25-foot shark. You'd have to use jaws for bait to catch one of these megalodons. Dr. Baugh is raising piranha in an aquarium with a stronger magnetic field around it. Just increasing the magnetic field is doing something because his piranha are 4 times larger than normal. When he raised fruit flies in a hyperbaric chamber, they live 10 times longer than normal, just by increasing air pressure. If you combine the air pressure and the filtered sunlight and the stronger magnetic field, you'd probably get Garden of Eden conditions. They probably lost at least those things, maybe at least those 3 things. Maybe more things have been lost since then. Turtles got pretty good size. That's a big turtle. Oysters were found 2 miles above sea level, 11-foot oysters weighing 600 pounds, 2 miles above sea level in the Andes Mountains. When they climbed Mount Everest, they found petrified clams on top of Mount Everest. Interesting thing about these clams, they're petrified and they're closed. Now, I'd like to point out, Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach, first of all, okay? About 450 miles to the beach. And clams do not climb mountains very well. And when a clam dies, it opens. You can walk along the beach and find 1 million seashells. You hardly ever find a matched pair. And you never find them closed if they're dead. They open right away. How do you get petrified closed clams on top of Mount Everest? I think there was a flood. But I don't think the flood was over Mount Everest. Mount Everest wasn't there. Psalm 104 tells us the mountains arose during the last part of the flood. The mountain ranges formed during the end of the flood, probably as a result of the Earth's crust being cracked open and busted up into pieces, and pieces would lift up and flex back and forth. Reptiles never stop growing. It's a simple fact. Most reptiles never stop growing. They grow all their life. People stop growing. When you're 16 or 18, you're going to quit growing, at least vertically. Some go horizontally thereafter, but reptiles never stop growing. What would happen to a reptile if you put him in the Garden of Eden and let him live to be 900 years old? You'd have a big lizard, a really big lizard. Dinosaurs were big lizards that lived with Adam and Eve before the flood came. You can get these Jackson chameleons right now at the pet store. What's he going to look like at about 15 tons? Probably some kind of triceratops. Dinosaur means terrible lizard, and dinosaurs lived with humans all through history. They just had a different name for them. But dinosaur bones and human bones have been found together. Dinosaur bones were found in the same rock strata as these fossilized human hands. Dinosaur bones and mammal bones found together. Here's one of the Ica stones showing a human riding a dinosaur. Dr. Baugh has a couple of the stones in his museum. We have 8 in our museum now of these Ica stones. I think we have the largest collection in America of these Ica stones from Peru. Many of them show dinosaurs on there. Dinosaur footprints and human footprints have been found together. In Glen Rose, Texas, I know there's controversy about this. I've been there 5 times. I've heard all the critics on it. And I've been there myself to check it out, okay? But go to Dallas, Texas, and go south 45 miles to Glen Rose, and you'll find the Paluxy River flows through this little town, and it's all full of limestone. The whole area is limestone, kind of like around here in Knoxville. Well, that river cuts through this limestone layers. In 1908, there was a flood. The river dropped 17 feet per mile, but this flood was incredible. It was, I think, 30 feet above flood stage or something. It was just an incredible flood in 1908. It ripped off the bottom of the river, tore off the layer of limestone. 2 foot of limestone was ripped up. Underneath was a new layer of limestone, and when the river dried up that next summer, they discovered there are hundreds of dinosaur footprints. Dinosaur footprints. It's called Dinosaur Valley State Park. They chiseled out lots of the footprints and took them to museums to save them so they wouldn't get eroded by the river. Took out huge blocks in the 1930s and set them up under dinosaur skeletons. Footprints are big. Here's a little kid taking a bath in one. But sometimes in this area, they find human footprints with the dinosaur footprints. Human tracks and dinosaur tracks together. Here's a trail of human tracks and crossing a trail of dinosaur tracks. And the human footprints, some of them are pretty good size, and occasionally they're found inside the dinosaur footprint. Well, if you're running through the mud to escape the flood, that's the logical place to step, right where somebody else already stepped. Just like walking through deep snow. And I think a lot of people get the wrong idea. They think Noah got in the ark, the rain started, and everybody died in the first 10 minutes. It probably took 6 months to kill everybody on this planet. They'd be running looking for high ground. The water kept coming up. See, the rain was 40 days, but the Bible says the water kept coming up for 150 days because most of the water is coming from inside the crust of the earth, up through the fountains of the deep. The flood, the rain did almost nothing for the flood. It was water from inside that caused the flood. It probably took 6 months to kill everybody. So they'd be running, when the tide goes down, they'd run to higher ground, and pretty soon they'd be fighting for this higher ground, which is becoming more and more scarce. They chiseled out rock ledges and found more footprints underneath the undisturbed limestone. One of the footprints was sawn across the toes. They looked at it end grain, and you can see where it squeezed down and distorted the lamination lines. I know there's arguments about it. I've read, I think, everything on the topic. Sure read a lot, but I'm very convinced they're legitimate. The footprints have a 6 to 7 foot stride. This would take a big man to be stepping 6 or 7 feet every time. A friend of mine was down there when they were digging out the footprints. He wrote me this letter. He's now an assistant pastor at a Southern Baptist church in Arizona. He said, Dr. Hovind, I grew up in Glen Rose. I was on an excavation with Dr. Carl Ball. We followed the footprints of a man beside a dinosaur's footprints. It was as if the man were walking with the dinosaur. Nova was there to film the dig. There was also an evolutionist who was arguing with Dr. Ball the entire time. Nova didn't film much of the tracks or our dig, but they did interview the evolutionist. He told them he had not seen anything there to disprove evolution. What he didn't tell the camera was he had refused to turn around and look at the tracks we were working on. When they found one, they would tap him on the shoulder and say, sir, you want to look at this? He'd say, no, I don't want to see it. He stood with his back to the dig and the tracks while making these statements. Nova knew the man had not looked at the tracks, but they didn't report that. See, Nova apparently is committed to a theory called evolution, and anything that goes against the theory is just simply not going to be aired on TV, period. The theory has to be protected from criticism. One guy said, well, if they find human footprints with dinosaur footprints, all that proves is that there was a dinosaur with feet like a human. Well, now that's just a brilliant way to look at it, isn't it? Another example where the evolution theory is a hindrance to research. Well, creationists state that humans and dinosaurs were contemporaneous in time. Were this momentous statement true, and the names of its discoverers would thunder down the corridors of time as individuals who made one of the most outstanding discoveries of the 20th century? Well, unless there's a media blockout, that's true. Also, they found a hammer, a fossilized human hammer, a man-made hammer. People say they didn't have any iron before the flood. Oh, sure they did. The Bible says Tubal-Cain was an artificer in brass and iron. This bell found inside a lump of coal. They knew about iron and metals before the flood came. They were extremely smart. You kids will be taught in school that the geologic column represents the history of the earth and that the Carboniferous era is when coal formed. That's baloney. Coal formed at the time of the flood because that world was buried. They found a gold chain inside a lump of coal back in 1881 in Illinois. This iron pot found inside a lump of coal. This thing found inside solid rock, supposed to be 600 million years old. Here I am in Nampa, Idaho, holding what's called the Nampa image. A well driller found this little doll 320 feet down while he's drilling a well, probably a pre-flood doll. Advanced stone tools were found in a gold mine in California. They're digging in the middle of this mountain, digging a shaft back into a gravel pit under layers of lava supposed to be 55 million years old, and they find human tools in there. Professor Holmes of the Smithsonian was one of the most vocal critics of the California finds. He said, perhaps if Professor Whitney had fully appreciated the story of human evolution as it is understood today, he would have hesitated to announce the conclusions, notwithstanding the imposing array of testimony. Is he saying he shouldn't have announced this finding because it goes against the theory? Is that what he's saying? That's exactly what he's saying. And folks, I'm telling you, there are people that are so dedicated to that stupid evolution theory that they will block out from their mind and from print, if they can, anything that goes against it. They defend the theory with religious fervor. Smithsonian is very responsible for doing a lot of this stuff of hiding evidence against evolution. In 1950s, Thomas Lee from the National Museum of Canada found advanced stone tools in a gravel deposit. The problem was the gravel deposit had been dated 65 to 125,000 years old, which is way too old for humans to be in Canada. So the director of the museum was fired for refusing to fire the discoverer. Tons of artifacts disappeared into storage bins. The discovery had to be killed. It would have forced the rewriting of almost every book in the business. We can't have you find something that goes against our theory because all of the books we've printed talk about how wonderful the theory is, and now you're going to make us rewrite all these books, so you're fired. This coin was found by a well driller in Illinois, over 100 feet below the surface, never was analyzed. The flood buried that world. God not only told him what to do and how to live before the flood, he also told him what to eat. He gave him a perfect diet. There's a tribe of folks in northern Pakistan called the Hunza. The Hunza people never get cancer. When the tribe was first discovered, their average age was 160. This is one of the valleys up there in the Himalaya mountains. This led to the legend of Shangri-La. How many have ever heard of the valley of Shangri-La, the valley where you live forever? Well, they didn't live forever, but they lived an awfully long time. The Hunza people's favorite food to eat is apricot seeds. Now today they typically live to be about 90. They've had a lot of contact with the outside world. Apricot seeds are kind of interesting. They take the apricot seeds and squeeze them and get oil out of them. They put the oil on their skin and the women don't wrinkle. They're really good looking at 70 and 80. Hunzas eat these apricot seeds like we eat peanuts. They just love them and they never get cancer. You know, people that take nutritional therapy to cure cancer have a much better survival rate. Now, they don't all still survive, I understand, okay, but it's about 10 times the opportunity to live than it is from taking the conventional therapies. Back in 1845, a doctor in Vienna, Austria, was horrified because 30% of the women giving birth in the hospital died. 30%. So this doctor noted that the doctors would examine the bodies of the women who died and then, without washing their hands, go examine the next expectant mother. They didn't know about microscopic organisms back then. But Dr. Semmelweis insisted that doctors in his hospital wash their hands after examining a dead body. The death rate dropped to 2%. Anybody know what happened to Dr. Semmelweis because of his great discovery? He was fired. 3 hospitals in a row fired him. Finally, he ended up in a mental institution where a patient murdered him, just for insisting you wash your hands. 3,000 years earlier, in the book of Leviticus, God had told Moses, tell the people, when you touch a dead body, you are unclean, and wash your hands and your body before you touch anybody else. God said that 3,000 years before science figured it out. God said to every beast of the earth, to every fowl of the air, and everything that creepeth upon the earth, when there is life, I've given green herb. You mean everything that lived on earth ate plants before the flood came? That's exactly right. You say, Brother Hovind, look at those teeth. Now that's a meat eater. No, that's a panda bear. You know, sharp teeth do not indicate meat eating. There's a deer in China. It's called the water deer. You can look it up on the internet. Water deer. Has teeth like a saber-toothed tiger. You look at a saber-tooth. Oh, wow, that's a meat eater. No, that's a vegetarian, okay? How about that one? Now, that's a meat eater. Look at those sharp teeth, Hovind. No, sorry, that's a fruit bat. How about that one? That's a meat eater. No, that's a vegetarian monkey. There's a lion that refused to eat meat all of its life. Lived to be 11 years old. It was used in movies as an actor. Finally got killed in an accident on the movie set. Refused to eat meat of any kind. After the flood's over, Genesis 9, God blessed Noah and the boys and said, go have a bunch of kids. And boy, they did too. Here we are. He said, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth. You know, the first change after the flood, animals became afraid of man. They weren't afraid before. Now they became afraid of man. Second change after the flood, God said, Noah, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Now you can eat meat. And because of that, there's a lot of suffering in the world. Animals suffer so we can eat, and it's perfectly fine to eat meat. But God made a perfect world, and man destroyed it. Man brought death and sin into this world. Paul said, for I reckon, that proves he's a Southerner, that the sufferings of this present time, is there suffering in the world today? Lots of it. The whole world's filled with groaning and travailing and pain. Charlie Darwin said, I'm bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically, but there seems to be so much misery in the world. Charlie couldn't understand why God made a world with suffering. Charlie, God didn't make a world with suffering. But Charlie Darwin thought, from the war of famine and nature and death, war of nature was from famine and death, the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving. Wait a minute. Charlie, are you saying that war and famine and death is what exalts us to a higher level? That's exactly what he says, and that's exactly what evolution teaches today. Nothing's changed. Death is the hero of the plot for the evolutionist. The Bible says God made a perfect world. Man wrecked it. By one man, sin came into the world, and death by sin. It was Adam's fault. You can't blame a wrecked car on the manufacturer. Send a picture to the manufacturer of a wreck and say, hey, why did you build a car like this? It didn't look like this when it left the factory. Today, folks, we are living in a junkyard. I like living on planet Earth, and Knoxville's a beautiful place, but I'm telling you, folks, this is nothing compared to what Adam and Eve saw. This is a junkyard. But God's going to fix it back. Someday the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid and the calf and the young lion and a fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. A little child's going to lead a leopard or a lion? You say, Hovind, lions don't eat grass. Oh, they will one day. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. A guy in Canada sent me a video clip of bears in his yard eating grass for 2 hours straight. Just nothing but grass. The Bible says the child shall die 100 years old. They're going to rule and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, there's not enough scripture to be real dogmatic, but it appears that there's going to be a 1,000-year span coming after the end of this age, when if you're saved, you're going to get to live here for 1,000 years. with everything fixed back, Garden of Eden conditions. Kids, you're going to get to have your own pet dinosaurs. That's going to be cool. Then he's going to make new heavens and a new earth. Isaiah 65, 2 Peter 3, new heavens, new earth. Revelation 21, new heaven, new earth. You can't even imagine what that's going to be like. I sure can't. The Bible says, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither have entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. God has things planned for his kids that you can't even think about. I'm going to give you one to try to think about. This is the electromagnetic spectrum. I taught physics. I got to get this in here somewhere. This contains all the different wavelengths, radio waves, microwaves, including a little bitty slice called light. The color spectrum, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Your eyeball is able to see those colors, but that's only a small piece of a huge spectrum.
The electromagnetic spectrum, an immense scale we use to measure the wavelengths of all kinds of radiation. At one end are radio waves with the longest wavelengths. At the other end are gamma rays with the shortest. In between are the other bands, including visible light, which is such a tiny fraction of the whole, it's difficult to imagine. How small is the visible spectrum? If you had a reel of movie film representing the entire electromagnetic spectrum, stretching 2,500 miles from California to Alaska, the section containing the visible spectrum would fall somewhere in the middle, near the University of Washington.
This frame is the whole visible spectrum. It is one frame and over 2,000 miles of tape, and it's everything that the human eye can see.
Suppose God gives us new eyes when we get to heaven, and we're able to see the entire spectrum. That means there'll be brand new colors. Not new shades of these colors. I'm talking brand new colors. Hey, suppose we get to heaven, and God gives us new eyes that can see the whole spectrum, and we'll be able to see the sounds coming off the musical instruments. Right now we can only hear them. What if you could see them or smell them? C major diminished. What if we get new ears that can hear the whole spectrum? What if you could hear the colors or smell them or taste them? We've only got 5 senses, folks. Maybe there are more. But if God just took these 5 and expanded them to the max, we would spend forever walking around heaven going, wow. Have you smelled that? Lick that. Wow. My first computer was an IBM XT8088, 4.77 megahertz. When you told it to load a program, you might as well go get lunch and open the mail and take a nap, because it's going to be a while. How many had one of those old-time computers? We've upgraded. My computer sitting here now is a Pentium 4, 3.4 gigahertz with hyperthreading, 60 gig hard drive, 2 gig of RAM. The same programs run, but they're much faster, and they're in color. That's called a systems upgrade. Did you know if you like living in your body with the sights and sounds and tastes of this world, wait till you get to heaven. You're headed for a systems upgrade that's going to blow your mind. The only question is, are you going? Paul said, I knew a man in Christ 14 years ago who was caught up to the third heaven. I think he's talking about himself. I think he actually died and was caught up to the third heaven. And he heard things that were unspeakable. You can't even explain it. Hey, could you explain colors to a blind man? Try it sometime. Can you explain sounds to a deaf person? Just try that sometime. Can you explain heaven to an earthling? Can't be done. You couldn't understand it. Beyond your capabilities. But boy, for the rest of his life, when Paul came back down, he was anxious to go back to heaven. He told the Philippians, I've got a desire to depart and be with Christ, but I'll stay here because you need me. Paul would go to town preaching, and they'd say, Paul, if you don't knock off that preaching, we're going to kill you. Really? Give me your best shot, man. Let's go. He was anxious to go. How about you? You ready to go?
Alrighty guys, now, like I said before, it was imperative that I dedicate that full section of the film to going through the creation narrative to make sure that we are all on the same page moving forward. So now that we have a basic understanding of what the creation perspective entails, we can begin to get a little bit more in depth and underway to the actual theory that I'm presenting. Now, if you think back to the beginning of that section when it discussed varying flood legends from all around the world and how even secular historical scholars conclude that all of these varying flood legends derive from a common source which predates them all, we can see the historical plausibility of these events actually having taken place. Now, obviously, there is some debate on whether or not it was just an older legend or an actual event, but when we couple that understanding with all of the scientific evidence pointing to the possibility of a global flood, and all of the signs that seem to be present pointing to that, the idea that there was an actual global flood becomes a lot more plausible. Now, in addition to that, while doing research for this video, I came across numerous different not only flood legends, but creation legends, which seemed to overlap with similarities. So again, we are confronted with this dilemma. Are all of these similarities the result of just another legend which predates them all, or of an event that actually took place? One of the varying creation legends in particular that caught my attention was the Egyptian creation legend. Now, I'm sure that many of you have probably seen this hieroglyph, and many of you have probably been led to believe through various shows like Ancient Aliens, for example, that these are actually depicting ancient light bulbs or some other form of electricity like a battery or something. But in actuality, this is depicting the Egyptian legend of creation.
This relief is not so mystical if you have a little understanding of Egyptian art and religious symbols. This is a variant depiction of the creation of the world in Egyptian mythology. The Egyptians believed that before anything else existed, there was a vast primordial sea of nothingness. They believed that the first thing to emerge from this sea was a lotus flower. This is probably because the lotus closes at night and sinks underwater. In the morning, it reemerges and blooms again. It was believed that the lotus flower then gave birth to the first god, who was often associated with the sun. This relief was done after the god Atum was merged with the sun god Ra, and thus became Atum-Re. Atum, the god who created everything else after this point, is actually represented by a snake. And yes, it is a snake in these reliefs, not light bulb filaments. You can actually see the eyes and other elements of a snake if you look closely. This is pretty standard Egyptian mythology, that the lotus flower came forth first, and then the first god Atum, who was represented by a snake. Well, what about this bubble surrounding it? I will quote an expert directly on this point. Quote, "Despite the variety of deities, the Egyptians conceived the origin of the world as singular. Only one god, Atum, was responsible for the emergence of the universe as a bubble of air in the vast, limitless, inert ocean and everlasting darkness of the undifferentiated primordial waters, none, that existed before creation. In other words, the universe came forth from the lotus in a bubble of air." The other elements of this picture back this interpretation up. The universal bubble is here being supported or raised up by the goddess Nun. Nun is the primordial waters, and technically it is she that raises up the lotus, Atum, and everything else. This pose of outstretched hands is one of the more common motifs for Nun, and she raises and supports the universe from nothingness. In some versions of the story, the sun god represented in these scenes is Khepri, who is represented as a scarab beetle. Atum and Khepri sort of traded off being aspects of Ra in Egyptian mythology. So in essence, in more common versions of this scene, you have Nun, the primordial waters, lifting up the solar barge of Ra for its first journey across the sky. And this explains why the exact same poses are seen in this creation scene at Dendera. They are also depicting Nun raising up the universe out of her waters. This idea is very, very common. You can see other images of Ra emerging from the primordial lotus as well.
Now, there are a few things that I want you to take away from that last clip and keep in mind as we move forward. First being that the Egyptians perceived creation emerging from primordial waters, and also that a pocket of air was created. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. Now, let's switch gears a little bit here and take on a topic that is sure to be very controversial with many of you. In school, we are all taught the heliocentric model of our solar system. The heliocentric model is the one that we are all familiar with, where the sun is in the center of our solar system and all of the planets orbit around it. However, What you probably did not know is that mathematically speaking, the geocentric model is every bit as viable.
So is everything we know wrong?
Well, if the Copernican principle is wrong, then yes. Because as Bob said, everything is interpreted through that epistemological grid. And if that foundational assumption is wrong, then yes, our picture of the universe is fundamentally wrong. Now, the scientists will argue back and forth about this. They are very invested in a very successful model. But that model has a lot of patches in it. Dark matter, dark energy, you know, these things have not been observationally confirmed. They believe they must be there because their formulas have gotten them so far, and so they'll plug in these other entities to make the equations work. But there is a strong and growing, very credible group of scientists who are beginning to question the Copernican principle. For example, we all learned about dark energy. Dark energy is causing the universe to accelerate its expansion. Well, George Ellis and a group that he works with, that we talk about in the film with, they said, wait a minute, let's just play with this for a second. Let's look at the world through a different view. Let's put Earth near the center, and let's get rid of the Copernican principle. Can we explain everything we see without dark energy? And the answer is yes, you can. And you will see many papers now in the peer-reviewed journals. They call it void cosmology. And the idea is that we're at the center of a void, and if we assume that the Earth is in that special non-Copernican position, we don't need dark energy to explain these observations. And that's big. That's big, because nobody has a clue what dark energy is.
Well, that's one of the things, Bob, isn't it? That it seems to me that, okay, so there's a big riddle here that, at least from the purely scientific point of view, there's this big riddle, and the riddle is, how does the universe work? Okay, at some point, you throw out a guess about some aspect of it, and then to support that guess, you have to come up with 3 more guesses, and to support those 3, they each spin off 10 more. Well, at what point do you get called on the fact, hey guys, every time you come up with one of these further guesses, you're further removed from anything observable.
Yeah.
But, it makes it on the cover of Time magazine, and the average Joe goes, ooh, dark matter. They have the slightest idea what that means. The guys hypothesizing it barely know what it means. So what does that say of the way I think everybody there's so many people in modern culture walk around with this like, ooh, science, wafting the incense at the altar of, and I mean, your point earlier, yeah, we know how a cell phone works and that's cool, but this stuff is so much theory and hypothesis and there's nothing to back it up. It's really kind of unscientific science.
Has there ever been an experiment done to prove that the Earth is revolving around the sun?
Yes, there was several experiments in the 1800s. Dominique Arago, Armand Fuseau, Augustin Fresnel, but one of the most famous was the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887.
Let's assume the ether frame moves relative to the Earth from left to right. Michelson-Morley used a half-silvered mirror to split a beam of light so that it travels in 2 different directions along 2 paths of equal length. This is the light beam before it is split. Moving in a perpendicular direction to the ether frame, this beam would be blown off course and would have to travel a little further. Traveling back down this path again, perpendicular to the ether, would also move this beam off course, if the ether existed. This beam, moving parallel to the ether and in the same direction, would increase its speed. This beam, again parallel to the ether, but moving in the opposite direction, would be slowed down. Here the 2 light beams are recombined together, and if they are in phase, they will constructively interfere. But if the speed was different in the 2 paths, they would combine to give an interference pattern.
No. Tell us about that.
Well, they used light beams to measure whether the Earth was moving, and they found that there was no movement. The Earth has to be moving 30 kilometers per second to complete its annual revolution, and they found out that it wasn't moving in a very precise. Michelson could have calculated it to 1/100th of what he got in his experiment. That's how sensitive his instruments were.
What did the experiment involve in terms of apparatus, so we can get a concrete understanding of
Well,
what they
if
found?
if the Earth is moving around the sun, and we shoot that light beam in the direction that the Earth is moving, okay, and then we shoot another light beam perpendicular to that, well, the one that's in the direction of the Earth's movement should be impeded in some way if it's moving through space, whereas this one that's going perpendicular would not be impeded.
Why not?
Because it's not going through space. It's just going north and south.
Okay.
Okay? And what they found, they expected to have a 30-kilometer difference between these two light beams. There was no difference. So the natural interpretation, and even Einstein admits this, Mach admits this, Born admits this, the natural interpretation is that the Earth isn't moving. So how do we get out of that? Well, you invent special relativity. And now you say, well, the reason that light beam wasn't affected when it went toward the motion of the Earth is because the apparatus shortened.
Huh?
Yeah, Michelson's apparatus shortened as it was going with the Earth in its orbit around the sun.
No, wait, you're telling me that the contraction of mass was invented to explain away the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment?
Yes, and that's what my book will tell you, and it's been admitted by all the scientists.
Well, isn't there any experimental confirmation that as you approach the speed of light, there's a contraction effect? The impression is that there's all kinds of experimental confirmation.
That was invented. There's no proof to it.
Really?
Yes, all the physicists will tell you there's no proof
Not
to
that
it.
I'm surprised, you understand.
Yeah.
I know what the scientific community is capable of in terms of mass deception. Evolution is a mass deception. But I wasn't aware that they don't really have any even purported scientific confirmation in terms of physical measurement.
No, nobody
of the contraction effect.
Nobody measured a contraction. But they put it into a mathematical formula called the Lorentz transform, and it's probably the most famous equation used in physics today.
Does anyone expressly admit that, hey, we had to come up with this contraction effect because otherwise we're stuck with a motionless
Yes,
Earth?
the very guy who invented it.
Tell me what he
Heinrich Lorentz.
admitted.
Heinrich Lorentz says, I don't have any other explanation to this experiment of Michelson-Morley unless I contract the apparatus. Otherwise, we're going to have to believe the Earth is standing still in space.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Can you give an approximate page reference for me to your book? I want to go back and read that right away.
I'll send you an email. I'll show you where it is.
If a telescope is pointing at a star and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path, but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further.
Here's another objection. If everything is moving, in other words, all the stars in the universe are moving, how could we possibly determine if we are the center of this moving universe?
Over the past decade or so, we have seen out to the very limits of the observable cosmos. We've mapped its largest structure, the cosmic microwave background, the oldest light in the universe according to the standard Big Bang model of cosmology. What we have discovered is shocking.
On the very largest scales, we see a pattern of really big hot and cold spots which line up around a special axis, which has been dubbed the axis of evil. And it's quite puzzling. Why is there a special direction in space?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you asked that, because in 2009 they set up a probe called the Planck probe. It just came back with the results in 2013 in March. I don't know if you heard about it or not.
No.
The European Space Agency set it up in cooperation with NASA. This was the third attempt that they had to nullify the data that they were finding in the cosmic microwave background radiation that permeates the whole universe, that the Earth was in the center of the universe. The first one they set up was in 1990 called the COBE probe. It came back, showed the Earth was in the center. The WMAP was the second one in 2001, came back with the same data. And what they tried to do was say that this was all an error. It was some kind of misreading, or it was, there was contamination in the apparatus or the sky or whatever. So they sent up a third probe in 2009, just came back in 2013. Guess what? Same exact results. Same exact results. And what were the interpretations? Well, the Earth has to be in the center of the universe. And we have somebody quoted in our book, Lawrence Krauss of the Arizona State University, who says, yeah, this means we're in the center of the universe.
Let's pick up on that point a bit. You mentioned that the background radiation, microwave radiation in the universe, supplied data from which it became apparent that the Earth was in fact at the center of a moving universe. Explain why that is so. Why do these data confirm that?
Okay. Well, the Big Bang Theory predicts that there was an explosion 13.7 billion years ago. Okay? So if there was an explosion, then that means the explosion had to come out equal on all sides of the sphere. It had to be what they call homogeneous. Okay? And that's naturally accepted. It's like homogenized milk.
Sure.
You know, you shake that thing up and you can't see one place from another place. It's all homogenized. And that's what they needed for this Big Bang universe. What they found when they sent these three probes up, yeah, some of it was homogeneous, but it's like having a bowl full of Jell-O with two swords going through the middle of the Jell-O.
What are the swords?
The swords are the orientation of the cosmic microwave background radiation throughout the universe.
What do you mean by the orientation?
Okay, there's hot and cold spots they found. It's not homogeneous. There's hot and cold spots in this microwave background radiation, and if you align all these cold spots, it forms an X through the whole universe.
Unbelievable.
And guess what's in the middle?
Oh, you're kidding.
No.
This is what the data show.
This is what the data shows.
Okay, come on now. What mainstream publication recognizes
the
this?
University of Michigan, Dragon Hutterer, Craig Copey, Glenn Starkman. These are all the guys who have done all the work on this microwave radiation. They write it in their papers. They wrote one in 2004, 2008, 2010, and 2012, and they're writing another one on the Planck probe.
So you're saying these space probes were designed to explain away the X represented by the hot and cold spots?
They wanted to make sure it wasn't an accident.
Okay, so there were how many probes in total?
3 in 20 years.
And you're saying that all 3 confirmed what then?
That the Earth is in the center of the universe.
On the basis of the hot and cold spots?
Yes.
Whose alignment represents an X.
An X.
And at the center of the X is the Earth.
Right, and they call that X the axis of evil. That was coined.
Scientists call that the axis of evil.
Called it the axis of evil. That was coined in 2004 when Bush went into Iraq. Remember, he called them the axis of evil? So this cosmologist just picked it up and said, yeah, well, here's the axis of evil right here in the universe.
So, in other words, they're enraged by the finding.
Oh, yeah.
Because it upsets their worldview, which has to displace the Earth's special position in the universe.
Yeah.
which fits in rather nicely with a divinely created universe.
Right.
Made for man.
All of cosmology is based on what we call the Copernican principle. Every piece of data that they get in their telescope has to be filtered through the Copernican principle. And that's what the Big Bang Theory does, NASA does it, ESA does it, everybody does it. The upsetting thing about this microwave radiation is it just totally defies the Copernican principle.
The last probe confirmed that as well, you say?
The last probe, yeah. As a matter of fact,
where was that result reported? Obviously everywhere, but give me some examples.
March 21st in the European Space Agency report. As a matter of fact, it's in our movie.
What's their attempt to explain the latest probe's findings away?
Anomalies.
Anomalies?
Mm-hmm.
And all the anomalies conveniently line up in a non-anomalous way to verify their model.
Right.
This is amazing. So this brings us to the question of motive. We've been hinting at it throughout the discussion. There's obviously a motive at work here. Many people have recognized, not just believers, not just Catholics, but people like David Berlinski, for example, that science has become an ideology. Maybe you could take up that theme as we close out this interview.
Yeah.
Isn't there an ideological component?
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say it's a religion. Science is a religion today. It's scientism. And they've already got the parameters within which they want to interpret the data, and they're not going to go outside those parameters. This is a perfect example. You do get some of them that break out of it, and they say, yeah, well, this defies the Copernican principle. We've read many papers like that, and we quote them in our book. Okay? But the motivation is, if the Copernican principle is wrong, that means all of science is wrong. Everything, cosmogony, paleontology, cosmology, archaeology, everything now becomes suspect because we can't support these long ages. We can't support this vast universe. As a matter of fact, we're in the center of it. How does that happen? Well, it's not going to happen by chance. Someone had to put it there, you see, and that's what they're scared of. That's the motivation.
Let's say we just use modern science, just for the sake of argument. Let's say we use Einstein's general relativity, invented in 1915. Well, Einstein's general relativity said there's no difference between an Earth fixed in the universe and the universe going around it, as opposed to the universe remaining fixed and the Earth rotating. Those two are equivalent. Why? Because everything's relative in general relativity, you see. So modern science can't refute the idea. It was Einstein, Mach, Born. I mean, you go down all the prominent scientists of the day, they all agreed, yeah, there's no way we can refute that. The universe can go around the Earth, or the Earth can rotate inside a fixed universe. Which one is true, they can't tell us. You see, that's the key point here. They can't tell us. Science can only go so far.
Right.
And then you have revelation, you see.
Yes.
And revelation fills the gap.
Absolutely.
Okay?
You know, it's interesting when you think about, okay, you know, if we are, I'll borrow the prop myself. So here we are, assuming in the studio that the studio is the universe. We're on here looking out. And how do we know? I mean, if this is moving versus that's moving.
Very good point.
Yeah.
This is the key.
You're the fish in the aquarium. So how can you be in the aquarium and make an observation from outside the aquarium? You're in it.
What a brilliant observation, Michael. And you put your finger on it. Because one of the interesting things about this film is that 500 years ago, you were crazy if you thought the Earth was rotating on its axis. Yeah. 500 years later, you're crazy if you think it isn't. Yeah. I guarantee you the universe hasn't changed, right? So what has changed is our view. Yeah. In other words, oh, you're crazy to think, no, I'm afraid that's not going to work. Because physics itself had to reinvent itself at the beginning of the 20th century by Albert Einstein because they couldn't measure that assumed motion of the Earth around the sun. One of the more interesting parts of our film is that experiment, that 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment, where they could not measure what they were sure was happening. So you have two doors. You have door number one. Well, maybe it ain't moving around the sun. Can't have that.
Right.
Door number two is we get to reinvent physics from the ground up.
Again.
And we have to say, yes, we have to say, no experiment can detect absolute motion. All physics can do is describe relative motion. And Einstein even says, it's a quote in our book, it is equally valid under relativity to talk about the Earth motionless at the center and the universe rotating around it, or the Earth rotating on its axis and the universe being steady.
So there you have it, guys. The geocentric model of our universe is equally, if not more so, plausible as the heliocentric model. Now, so far in this video, we have addressed the basics of creationism and the basics of geocentrism. But now we're really going to get into the hard-hitting, missing element of this whole theory.
If I were to ask you, or any random person, who was the most brilliant man of the modern era, what would be the answer? The answer, of course, for most people would be Albert Einstein. He is viewed as the man who changed mathematics and the way we perceive the universe. Most of the now widely accepted work in higher mathematics after Einstein was based on his theories. What if I were to tell you that there was another man that lived when Einstein did? A man who accomplished more than Einstein could dream of. A man who challenged all the theories Einstein proposed. A man whom Einstein actually agreed with in 1920. But this fact seems to go largely unnoticed. This man has been accused of all sorts of things. He was accused of everything from being a mad scientist to being some kind of wizard, and was seen as a heretic to modern science and mathematics. This man is someone whom science wanted to forget, and whom all bankers of the time cut off funding to. This man died penniless and alone, with only pigeons to keep him company. One of his last projects was a new theory of gravity. According to FBI documents acquired via the Freedom of Information Act request, the sum of this man's possessions consisted of about 2 truckloads of material and approximately 30 barrels and bundles, which were seized upon his death in 1943 by agents of the now defunct Office of Alien Property Custodian. One document states that it is reported to have some 80 trunks in different places containing transcripts and plans having to do with experiments. This man's research was seen as so dangerous that it has never been declassified by the government. This man was a physicist with more formal training in the field than Albert Einstein, who was a patent clerk. This man had a photographic memory and spoke 6 languages. He showed genius at an early age and was able to perform integral calculus in his head, though his teachers thought him to be cheating. Did he accomplish anything with this genius? This one man invented radio, AC power, which is used worldwide today, laser, radar, X-ray, wireless communication, particle beam weaponry, wireless electricity, cellular technology, the electron microscope, microwave technology, hydroelectric generators, neon lights, fluorescent lights, brushless synchronous and induction motors, bladeless turbine and pump, remote control, electronic robotics, just to name a few. He predicted things like the BlackBerry in 1909. Before the 1900s, he demonstrated remote control boats. Who was this man? Nikola Tesla. Why was this man so dangerous? Tesla said things like this about Einstein's work. It is a magnificent mathematical garb which fascinates, dazzles, and makes people blind to the underlying errors. The theory is like a beggar, clothed in purple, whom ignorant people take for a king. Its exponents are brilliant men, but they are metaphysicists, meaning they deal with the supernatural, rather than scientists. Supposing that the bodies act upon the surrounding space, causing curving of the same, it appears to my simple mind that the curved spaces must react on the bodies, and producing the opposite effects, straightening out the curves. Since action and reaction are coexistent, it follows that the supposed curvature of space is entirely impossible. But even if it existed, it would not explain the motions of the bodies as observed. Only the existence of a field of force can account for the motions of bodies as observed, and its assumption dispenses with space curvature. All literature on this subject is futile and destined to oblivion. So are all attempts to explain the workings of the universe without recognizing the existence of the ether and the indispensable function it plays in the phenomena. My second discovery was a physical truth of the greatest importance. As I have searched in the entire scientific records in more than a half a dozen languages for a long time without finding the least anticipation, I consider myself the original discoverer of this truth, which can be expressed by this statement: there is no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. Now, what is the ether? Some think of it as a firmament, which our universe exists within. Yes, just like the firmament spoken of in the Bible book of Genesis. Tesla said a good example for such an interaction becomes apparent in gravitation, which should rather be named universal compression. I think the material bodies do not gravitate between each other, but it is the ether that makes one material body to press to another. We wrongly call this phenomenon gravitation. The stars, planets, and all the universe appeared from the ether, when some part of it, due to certain reasons, became less dense.
Now, the idea that everything is connected is a very old idea. Even in science, in the late 1800s, there was a belief that there was an invisible web of energy that connects everything in the 1800s. And scientists were in a very heated debate, very controversial, as to whether or not this field exists. There was a very famous experiment that was conducted to determine if the field called the ether field actually existed. In the year 1887, the very famous Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to tell once and for all, is the field here or no? Yes or no? The field exists? It does not exist. In my opinion, it was a good experiment. However, it was poorly interpreted. For over 100 years, our science has been based in a belief that is incorrect. It's incorrect. Now, this is very interesting. 100 years later, 1986, the United States Air Force repeated that experiment. 1986, the United States Air Force replicated the Michelson-Morley experiment. They published the results in the very prestigious journal Nature, the scientific journal Nature. What they found was this. They repeated the experiment with good equipment, much better equipment. The bottom line is that the field exists. They found that the field is actually there. This is reported in August 1986, the journal Nature, volume 322. They said, the field is there. And not only is the field there, it measured precisely the way that Michelson and Morley had predicted 100 years earlier. They just didn't have the equipment to work this out. Now, why don't we know about this? This should have made the cover of every major magazine and newspaper. This should have been on CNN headline news or Sky News. But this changes everything for the scientists, because the textbooks all say the field is not there. Entire careers are based on the field not being there. And now the field is there.
Einstein's theories were based on the non-existence of the ether. What is not presented much in media is that Einstein himself doubted his theories on multiple occasions. In 1920, he said, "But on the other hand, there is a weighty argument to be adduced in favor of the ether hypothesis. To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical quality whatsoever. The fundamental facts of quantum mechanics do not harmonize with this view. Recapitulating, we may say that according to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable. For in such space, there not only would be no propagation of light, but also no possibility of existence for standards of space and time, measuring rods and clocks, nor therefore any space-time intervals in the physical sense. Media presents the idea of Einstein-based mathematics as fact. We are told that this is concrete and that the entire scientific community is in total agreement. This could not be farther from the truth. In fact, calling it mathematics at all is misleading. These are theories with no absolutes. There are two divided camps, one that believes there is an ether and one that doesn't. All we are presented with on television is the theories that rely on no ether existing and then replacing the ether with things like dark matter to try to make all the theories work. So what is modern science? The belief in theories based on a man who doubted his own theories, which incorporate dark matter, which these scientists are not even sure exists. What am I trying to say here? Science does not give you or have all the answers. When you hang on every word of people like Stephen Hawking, know that there are many people whom are just as brilliant who completely disagree with them.
We must first understand the current theory of gravity and its problems before we go further towards other theories, so let's take 1 minute to do just that. The most widely accepted theory of gravity right now is Einstein's general theory of relativity. Although the mathematics in this theory are founded upon very complicated equations involving tensors, ultimately the actual mechanism and physics of how gravity is formed is just that mass, somehow through unexplainable means, using no energy or momentum, interacts with interwoven space and time, curving it around mass. Space and time is just simply standard three-dimensional space, with a fourth dimension being change in that space, or time. The problems with this view of gravity are numerous. As per calculations, the majority of mass in the galaxy must be undetectable dark matter, or else the galaxies would not be able to hold together as they do at the measured speeds of rotation around their galactic core. Also, there must be another undetectable force named dark energy, which is facilitating the measured expansion of the galaxies moving away from each other equally in all directions, something is impossible in all current theories of gravity. Also, closer to home, the perihelion precession, which is basically just a slight shifting of planetary orbits over time, cannot be completely explained with Einstein's equations of general relativity. Although the math of general relativity greatly increased the calculated accuracy of these events, another undiscovered planet expected to be roughly the size of Jupiter must be orbiting our Sun to account for the remaining inconsistencies. Yet Einstein's general theory of relativity is proven correct in many other ways time and time again, or has it? Right now, let's go over this new theory of dynamic gravity and see if it can explain gravity better. First, though, we have to understand that magnetic fields are facilitated by virtual photons, and magnetic fields can interact with each other. Forcing two similar poles of a magnet together will cause the fields to repel each other, creating force. And when two equally sized magnets are combined so that the opposite poles combine, the end result is not a magnetic field twice the strength, only larger by the size of the magnet, but rather a field that, while stronger, has also been displaced out slightly further and larger than it was previously. So what do magnets have to do with gravity? Maybe a lot more than you think. The electromagnetic force is a fundamental force that binds a proton and electron together, and it also creates magnetic fields when large clusters of atoms located in specific areas of the periodic table have a charge from electrons in the valence electron shell. But let's forget about magnetic fields, since a magnetic field is clearly not gravity. But a new force that would act as gravity does, and we will hereafter call gravity, is created when atoms of molecules are forced tightly together, encroaching their separate electromagnetic force fields, which are facilitated by virtual photons. The fields are displaced in similar fashion to encroaching magnetic fields, particularly under the immense pressure and heat found at the core of celestial bodies. Once a critical limit is reached, the effect would grow exponentially, which would allow the electromagnetic force to reach vast distances and remain exceptionally strong. And this displaced force would pull and attract all electrons, particularly the ones found in the outer orbital shells and atoms. Almost all physical matter contains electrons, hence almost all matter would be drawn to the source of this displaced field, exerting force pulling the electrons, but not enough to break them away from their orbital positions and away from their parent protons. Two separate electromagnetic forces will be exerted on the electrons simultaneously. The end result will be a net force exerted on the entire atom as a whole towards the source of the external electromagnetic field, and of course pitting electrons into seemingly chaotic orbital paths, contributing to the mystery of the electron cloud. However, there is at least one known particle of matter that does not contain an electron, the unpaired proton, the sole particle that is so unstable that its weight must still be deduced from the measured weight of hydrogen. According to the dynamic theory of gravity, this particle would not fall in the gravitational field and would hence be quite unstable in the gravitational field, eventually making its way free of the planet into space as hydrogen and helium eventually do. But there is more to this theory than a simple attractive force. As the name dynamic gravity implies, there are opposing forces. Not only is there the attractive nature of this force pulling towards it all negative entities in the electromagnetic force, the electrons, but because the cores of celestial bodies are generating enormous gravitational fields associated with the positive force of the electromagnetic force from the protons, it would then be expected that celestial bodies would not only pull themselves together, they would also repel, ensuring that celestial bodies would never, under normal circumstances, collide once they have reached a certain size. This repulsive field could, under certain circumstances, like galactic black hole cores, could completely attribute to the force currently known as dark energy.
Newton's apple does not fall to the ground because of the downward force of gravity, but because of the upward momentum of electromagnetic radiation or light. Gravity is not a real force at all. It is a secondary force to the electromagnetic force. Objects just freefall towards the greatest energy because it has the slowest rate of time, or the greatest time dilation. I believe this can be seen in the mathematics, with both the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force having the inverse square law. We have the inverse square law because the surface area of the light sphere increases with the square of the radius. Thus the strength of the gravitational field is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source. There is no mysterious action at a distance. The gravitational field will work at the speed of light because it is an integral part of one universal process with the electromagnetic force. We have one universal process that begins with the quantum wave particle function or probability function of quantum mechanics, expanding out as an inverse sphere, and ends with the inverse square law of gravity and Newton's third law of motion. To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Gravity is the opposite reaction to the atoms radiating quantized spherical wavefronts of electromagnetic radiation. We have one interactive, universal process continuously unfolding at the quantum level of the atoms. We see and feel this process as time, as a physical process of continuous energy exchange that is formed light-photon oscillation by light-photon oscillation. Objects form their own time by slowing up the rate that time flows relative to their energy and momentum. Gravity is not a real force at all. Objects just free fall towards the greatest energy because it has the greatest time dilation or the slowest rate the time flows. In this theory, mass is a byproduct of time dilation. When time slows down, it takes more effort to move an object from A to B, and this is seen as an increase in mass. Also, Einstein's equivalence principle between gravity and acceleration falls out of this theory. Because energy and momentum have to increase for an object to accelerate, time dilation will increase relative to the acceleration. Therefore, we have the equivalence principle between gravity and acceleration. This will be felt as inertia in the direction of the acceleration. Therefore, we have Isaac Newton's first law of motion. Unless acted upon by a net unbalanced force, an object will maintain a constant velocity. This theory takes the dynamic interactive process of the general theory of relativity and extends it to our everyday life, explaining a universe that is continuously coming into existence relative to the energy and momentum of our own actions. Every individual is a part of this interactive process that forms the uncertainty and probability that is needed for the great game of life. But above all, this theory gives us an objective understanding of time as a process of continuous creation. Even a rose blooming will create its own arrow of time within its own reference frame.
Now, the reason that was such a breakthrough for me in my research is because, as you heard at the end there, Nikola Tesla's dynamic theory of gravity implies a direct correlation to electromagnetic radiation, aka light, and gravity, along with time itself. This is huge. But real quick, before we get into that, I need to go through a few more kind of random clips that I have come across, which I will reference while explaining the theory. Now, this first one is sure to seem like it's coming completely out of left field and will seem completely random, but bear with me here.
There's no inside structure.
Is it hollow?
Yeah, there's only a surface. There's nothing inside.
Is the sun actually, do you believe, combusting in on
It's
itself?
not burning anything. There's no fusion in the sun. That's well understood.
Prove it.
Yeah, well, there's just not the way to prove that there is any. It's only in the flares that you get fusion. That's why all the X-rays. The flares, the arcs, and the X-rays, and the microwaves, and whatever result of fusion in the arcs. There's no fusion in the sun. They don't know how the sun works.
Why do you, what's special, how does the sun make light?
It's a transformer. Transforms from some other dimension. It's not burning anything. It doesn't have to. It's a converter.
Of what?
I don't know. Nobody knows. But that's what it does. That's the only thing it can do, because that's how everything works.
It's transforming from another dimension.
Yeah, you could say it's taking energy from another dimension, counter space. There's no energy, actually. Most of it you can't even measure in outer space or see.
You can't see.
No, you can't see the sun in free space.
So the sun is not visible in outer space.
Not in free space. It's only invisible when gross matter becomes involved, like the Earth's atmosphere and envelope and the surface of the moon or whatever. That makes the light. Otherwise, there is no light. You can see the moon, you can see the Earth, but you can't see the sun or you can't see the stars.
But you can see the planets and the satellite.
Right. You can see material objects, but you cannot see the sources of light. There is no light until there's a material object.
To reflect off.
So that means there's no time delay. So the whole time delay thing is meaningless. It doesn't take light years. There are no light years because there's no light. So that means that the light you see from the distant stars isn't 4 million years old. It could be only minutes old. It could be instantaneous. All the theories collapse when you can't see the stars in outer space.
So when I told that to Philo, oh, he was just completely bent out of shape. He couldn't have a better story than that, but he had to. So he disappeared into his bedroom. It was a typical madman, house of boxes, books all dusty, piled to the floor, the ceiling. You couldn't turn the TV off because of the weak cathode, so you put a piece of cardboard in front of it. The inventor of TV's son couldn't fix his own TV. It was a madhouse place, Lots of bottles of wine going down in his guts all the time. Drugs I've never even heard of before. But at any rate, that's where the action. When you live on the street, you're more tolerant. So he goes into his room and he pulls out this screwed up cardboard box, about this big. He dumps it on the table. And he goes, well, you're so smart. Tell me what these are. And I go, what do you got here? He goes, these are my father's tubes. Okay, well, I knew about the TV, but these weren't TV tubes. Okay, so I pick up the tubes. I've been playing with tubes since I was 6 years old. My grandmother used to build them in RCA. It's just in my genes. I look at these tubes, and these things they're crazy. Anybody would say this is insanity. Okay, big giant grids, but no cathodes, and like electrodes sticking out of the side, making all this stuff, and but the thing is, I know how to make tubes. So I'm looking at him, and I start to see what's going on here. And he's sitting there. Remember that cartoon character of that dog that would laugh with that kind of horse after the dog screwed somebody that screwed him? I forget the character. That's exactly how Philo laughed. It was that kind of... You couldn't really hear it. It was kind of like growling inside. He was content. So I pulled this one tube out, which was just an empty quart of glass, and it had an umbilical cord, so to speak, that came off of it to pump all the air out during operation. It was a laboratory tube. They broke it off the pump and discarded it after the experiment. Said two little metal shells pointing at each other, kind of like two little mirrors, coated with some kind of crappy-looking stuff, silver cesium oxide compound, and a simple ring in the middle. Well, it's a simple, electrostatic focus tube with an anode in the middle, and the two plates, the little tiny wires came in because the voltage was so high. And I guess it had to be oil or something around. It looked like it operated about 100,000 volts, which is a lot for a small tube. But I looked at the glass had been all attacked by something. So it used to be in the old color TVs, there was a certain tube that shorted out the high voltage so that it couldn't get out of control. It's called a shunt regulator, 6BK4. They go every color in the rainbow and make the TV repairmen sick. And what it does is it turns the radiation turns the glass on the tube chocolate brown. And that's how you can tell how long the tube's been in the set. So I'm looking at this glass, and it's like all baked by some kind of incredible electrical activity that couldn't have come through those little tiny wires. So I go, Philo, something took off in this tube, didn't it? Then he stopped laughing and got all crappy with me again. I go, Philo, tell me what happened in the tube. And so he told me I could see what happened. What happened is and this is about 1932, is Farnsworth was working with a radically new vacuum tube technology that did not use any of these glowing cathodes or any of these emitters. The patent situation back then was such that RCA owned radio. You couldn't build anything. That's what started in Bolinas with the Alexanderson system. Lit this thing up, a star appeared in the middle, turn off the power, and it stayed there for a brief period of time. So that changed my life forever. So here you have this giant laboratory and all these billions and billions and billions of kilowatt-hour dollars being expended and all the grooviness and frigate bird activity that goes along with it. And here's some guy in a laboratory on Green Street in San Francisco, okay, on a poverty existence because he's never gotten anything out of television, does the same thing in an empty bottle, so to speak.
Where's the suit
now? The Farnsworth family still has them, but it doesn't stop there. So what happened is my first laboratory got destroyed in San Francisco, and that's when I lost most of the RCA equipment. That's all based on the campaign slogan, Diane will make a difference. So that's when San Francisco basically swirled into the outgoing tide. So my 8 cents a square foot went to $1 a square foot. So now how are you going to move tons of switchboards 15 feet high, transformers that weigh 4,000 or 5,000 pounds? Commonweal already smashed the rest of it at RCA. The Park Service got my warehouse at Fort Mason, Pier 3. So everything went to the dump. And it was time to eat out of garbage cans again for another couple of years. So what I did is I made friends with a high school kid up there in Bolinas who was a prodigal genius type thing that Philo had trained at an early age. The kid was a genius beyond belief in a lot of different areas. He started hanging out with me. So we built a laboratory in his bedroom. So what I did is I took some of the remaining pieces from RCA and configured them. I decided, well, there's nothing else to do with this stuff other than make a Tesla coil. But make it the way Tesla decided to make it. At any rate, to make a long story short, we worked with this and experimented, went out to RCA, got more transmitter parts, because, I could always go back out and get more, because the station was still operating then. We build this thing. I take old burned out street lights. We're using the experiment. We get dumpster loads of them from Lease Light in San Francisco. The street lights off of Van Ness Street. They pull them out every certain amount of months. There's a whole dumpster full of them somewhere. There used to be. We put the street light in these monopolar fields that I just described from these coils. And the street light that we used for this experiment was the one we'd used previously for all of our spark gap experiments and everything. And something had started to transform with the bulb. We put this thing in the field within a matter of a minute or two of working the thing in the field. You have to be careful because they explode violently. Full galaxy appears inside the bulb, just like a picture of one of these Nova TV deals. You can spins, holding the stars, the nebulas, the suns, all the colors of the rainbow is spinning inside a burned out street light and virtually powering and containing itself, which has gone beyond the Farnsworth. Now we have a whole astronomical creation floating around in a light bulb on a workbench, and then it explodes the bulb. But after it explodes the bulb, for like a tenth of a second, it's not long, it sits there without any bulb to contain it. That's the creative force. This electrical monopolar field is how creation comes about. There is no evolution or any of that type of stuff. It's the electrical field at the time creates what exists, and it's always changing this way and that way. All living organisms are all based, just like all machines, are all based on the same mathematical function. All trees, plants, flowers, humans, everything's based on what's called the golden ratio. It's a definite geometric pattern, and all these electrical discharges associated with these Tesla transformers are all golden ratio proportioned and tend to be self-organizing and self-powering. So that ends the story. $1 trillion in the Livermore laboratories, and a deranged high school kid and a homeless person go beyond it in the laboratory. And that's how I was endeared to the Farnsworth family.
We come to the earth which, grew to get here, the way it is now. Here is our world, our planet Earth, floating in space. We will be going backward in time, imperfectly, but done in a very disciplined manner. Please notice there is no subduction, no rotation of tectonic plates, no twisting, no form-fitting, no altering shapes or sizes. It would be impossible for these continental plates to fit together perfectly without this being true, and yet the upper tectonic plates fit together perfectly on a much smaller planet. Yes, there's been some erosion, landslides, blah, blah, but overall this activity is insignificant. There is a kind of conspiracy of silence among certain scientists. They know, but are not telling you, that the upper tectonic plates of Earth also join in the Pacific. Not partially, they join totally. You are asked to believe that the continents swim or drift about willy-nilly, bumping and crashing as if they were on a greased skillet. This is not true. The simple truth is apparently too upsetting to too many apple carts. We're now going forward in time to show how the actual growth of the Earth took place. Imperfect as to details, but the overall is nailed. Antarctica, as you see, has become subtropical. Africa, on a smaller globe, moved way downward under the globe. In fact, for hundreds of millions of years, the bottom of Africa was the South Pole. South America's tail goes under and wraps around the bottom of Africa. Then, incredibly, it joins coast with Antarctica. 65 million years ago and more, these continents were joined, and marsupials like the duck-billed platypus roamed from Australia, Antarctica, and across southern South America and up into Africa. The platypus. Dinosaurs roamed all over this world on the upper tectonic plate because there were no oceans, just shallow seas. Here today, Antarctica is frozen over, and Australia and its surrounding islands are the remaining home of marsupials. Do you see how broadly the Pacific is opening compared to the Atlantic? This is exactly why the knee-jerk Pangea theory exists. The Pacific spread is too difficult to easily visualize because it's so big. The Atlantic spread is so obvious that a child would recognize it, but they are the same.